She heard him say it before her suitcase even touched the platform. "I think they sent the wrong." Amelia Harper had crossed 7 states in 4 days on a train that smelled like coal smoke and broken promises. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times. She had prepared herself for hardship, for silence, for the loneliness of a stranger's house. She had not prepared for this. The man who had agreed to marry her looked at her the way a cattleman looks at a lame horse, and every person on that platform heard every word. Before we go any further, if this story already has your heart beating faster, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world to me, and I read every one. Now stay with me, because what Amelia does next is going to change everything you thought you knew about strength, about belonging, and about what it truly means to be seen. This is part 1. The summer of 1885 came to Wyoming Territory, the way trouble usually did, quietly without warning, and with no intention of leaving soon. The train from Ohio pulled into Red Willow Station on a Tuesday afternoon, and half the town had turned out for the occasion. Not because they cared about Nathaniel Whitmore's domestic arrangements, but because there was precious little entertainment in a town of 400 souls, and the arrival of a mail-order bride was as close to theater as most of them were going to get all season. They gathered on the platform, the way people gather at the edge of a fire, close enough to feel the heat, far enough to claim they weren't watching. Nate Whitmore stood apart from them. He always stood apart. That was one of the first things people in Red Willow said about him. Not unkindly exactly, but the way you state a fact about the weather. Nate Whitmore was a man who occupied space without inviting company into it. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, and weathered in the particular way that Wyoming weather and personal grief will weather a man not beaten down exactly, but carved. Like something that used to have softer edges and had the softness worn away over time until only the essential shape remained. He had money, more than almost anyone in the territory. Blackthorn Ridge was one of the largest cattle operations in 3 counties, and Nate had built it with his own hands and his own stubbornness over the course of nearly 2 decades. The ranch ran like a machine because Nate ran it like a machine, precise, relentless, and without sentiment. The sentiment had gone out of Nate Whitmore 6 years earlier, when his wife Clara had died of fever in the February of 1879. In the bedroom of the house he had built for her with boards. He had hauled 40 miles himself, and he had held her hand through 3 days of burning and praying and bargaining with a God he had never entirely trusted anyway. And then she was gone, and the house had been quiet ever since, in the particular way that houses go quiet, when the person who made them a home is no longer in them. The ranch hands tiptoed around Nate for a year after that. Then they stopped tiptoeing because Nate was still standing and the ranch was still running, and a man who got out of bed every morning and did his work was a man who was going to be all right eventually. That was the general consensus in Red Willow. Nate Whitmore was going to be all right. He just needed time. 6 years passed, and Nate remained all right in the way. A locked door is all right. Functional, solid, impenetrable, and completely unable to let anyone in or out. It was his foreman, a broad-chested Tennessean named Roy Briggs, who finally said the thing that nobody else had been willing to say. They were riding the north fence line in the blue hour before sunrise, checking for damage from a storm that had come through 2 nights before. And Roy said it, the way Roy said everything, without preamble, without apology, like a man dropping a stone into a still pond and not particularly concerned about the ripples. "You need a wife, Nate." Nate kept his eyes on the fence line. "I had a wife, and you grieved her proper. 6 years is proper. But this ranch is going sideways, and it ain't the cattle, and it ain't the land, and you know it as well as I do." Nate said nothing. "The kitchen's a disaster. The supply records are a mess. The men haven't had a decent meal in 4 months since old Pete's back gave out and he can't cook anymore. I got 3 cowboys thinking about moving on to Henderson's operation, because Henderson's wife runs a proper supper table, and the men feel like human beings when they sit down to eat." Roy paused. "I'm not telling you to fall in love, Nate. I'm telling you to solve a problem." That was the framing that got through to Nate Whitmore, where nothing else had. Not sentiment. Not loneliness. not the yawning quiet of a house that smelled like cedar and disuse, and the faint memory of someone else's lavender. A problem. Nate Whitmore knew how to solve problems. He wrote to the agency in Denver 2 weeks later, and the letter he sent was so practical and so stripped of anything resembling romantic expectation that the woman who ran the agency, a sharp-eyed widow named Mrs. Catherine Polk, read it twice and then set it down on her desk and thought for a long moment before she reached for the appropriate file. The letter said, "I am seeking a woman capable of managing a household of approximately 20 men. She should be practical, hardworking, and experienced in domestic organization. Appearance is not a consideration. I am not looking for companionship. I am looking for competence." Mrs. Polk had been running the Denver matrimonial agency for 11 years. She had read a great many letters from ranchers and farmers and miners and merchants, and most of them, beneath whatever practical language they wrapped around their request, were lonely men who wanted to be seen and known and loved, and simply did not know how to say so without feeling like they were confessing something shameful. Nate Whitmore's letter was different. She believed he actually meant what he said, and she had exactly one woman in her files who was capable of meeting exactly those specifications, and who might Mrs. Polk thought also be capable of surviving what she suspected was actually being asked for, which was not just a housekeeper, but a woman strong enough to outlast a wall. Her name was Amelia Harper. She was 26 years old, from a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. Her father had been a farmer who died when she was 19, leaving her and her mother and 2 younger brothers to manage on almost nothing. She had organized what was left of the farm, negotiated with creditors, arranged her brothers' apprenticeships, and cared for her mother through 2 years of illness, before her mother also passed, and then she had found herself at 25 with no family, no prospects, no money, and a set of skills that the women of Columbus, Ohio had no particular use for, but that Mrs. Polk recognized immediately. Amelia Harper could organize anything. She could stretch a dollar until it begged for mercy. She could feed a room full of people with whatever was on hand and make them feel they'd been fed well. And according to every letter of reference Mrs. Polk had collected, she never complained. Mrs. Polk wrote back to Nate Whitmore that same week. The correspondence between them took 2 months. Nate asking practical questions, Mrs. Polk answering them. The 2 of them negotiating the terms of an arrangement that was on paper as businesslike as the sale of a good working horse. Amelia was consulted, but not much was asked of her preferences. She was told the essential facts: Wyoming territory, a large cattle ranch, a widower, 20 men to cook and clean for salary, in addition to room and board, a formal marriage ceremony to be performed upon arrival. She wrote back that she accepted. She packed everything she owned into one medium-sized suitcase and one smaller traveling bag, and she sat on the train for 4 days, watching the country outside the window. Change from the green softness of Ohio to the vast, spare, uncompromising openness of the West, and she allowed herself exactly one moment of fear, somewhere in the middle of Kansas, in the dark, when the train was running through empty country, and the stars were so thick and low they looked like you could reach out the window and touch them. One moment of sitting with her hands in her lap and thinking, "I do not know what I am walking into." And then the moment passed, and she straightened her spine and looked out at those stars and thought, "I have walked into hard things before. I am still here." She slept the rest of the way to Wyoming. The station at Red Willow was smaller than she had expected. The town was smaller. Everything was smaller and browner and drier and more sun-hammered than she had pictured, though she had not truthfully let herself picture much. She had learned early that the gap between what you imagined and what you got was where disappointment lived, and she had made a practice of keeping that gap as narrow as possible by not imagining too much. She stepped off the train onto the platform, and the heat hit her immediately, dry and clean, and so different from the thick summer heat of Ohio that it almost felt like a different substance entirely, like stepping into something bright and slightly dangerous. She looked for a man who might be Nate Whitmore. She did not have a photograph. He had not sent one. She had not asked. She found him almost immediately because he was standing slightly apart from the gathered crowd, in the way that a man stands when he is accustomed to being the tallest object in the room and has simply arranged himself accordingly. He was looking at her. Not the way a man looks at a woman he is glad to see. not the way a man looks at something that surprises him pleasantly. The way a man looks when he has ordered something from a catalog and the item that arrived is not the item he believed he was ordering. Amelia set her jaw and walked toward him. She was aware of the crowd. She was aware of the watching eyes and the half-suppressed whispers and the way two women near the station door leaned together and murmured something behind raised hands. She had been looked at like this before, like a problem, like an anomaly, like something that didn't quite fit the frame, and she had learned that the only way through it was to keep walking. She stopped 3 feet from Nathaniel Whitmore and looked up at him. He looked down at her. There was a long silence that felt much longer than it was, and then he said it. "I think they sent the wrong woman." He did not say it cruelly. That was the thing that would stay with Amelia longest in the days that followed when she turned the moment over in her mind, the way you press on a bruise to test how deep it goes. He did not say it to wound her. He said it the way a man states an observation about the weather. Factual, dispassionate, already moving past it toward the practical question of what to do about it, which was somehow worse. The platform went very quiet. Frank Dawson, who had been working Blackthorn Ridge for 15 years and who had driven the wagon out to collect the boss's new wife and her luggage, took one look at Amelia's face and then looked very carefully at his boots. 2 of the other hands who'd come along for the trip, young Caleb Moore and a quieter man named Harris, both found something extremely interesting to study in the middle distance. The townspeople did not look away. They watched with the undisguised interest of people who had come specifically for this kind of moment. Amelia stood very still. She was aware that she could cry. The tears were right there, sitting at the back of her throat, fully formed and ready, because she had crossed 7 states, and she had buried her mother, and she had let herself on the train in the dark, in the one unguarded moment she had allowed herself. Think the word hope, not loudly, not in a way that could be examined, just a small, quiet flutter of it. The way a bird moves in a closed hand. And this man had just used 7 words to describe everything she had feared about herself since the day her father died, and there was no one left to tell her she was worth something. She could cry. She chose not to. She picked up her suitcase. She had set it down when she stopped walking, some instinct toward composure, and she looked Nathaniel Whitmore directly in the eye. "I didn't come here to impress you, Mr. Whitmore," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "I came here because I know how to work." The silence stretched 1 beat longer. Then Frank Dawson coughed quietly into his fist and said, "Ma'am, let me take that bag for you." Nate Whitmore looked at Amelia for another long moment. Something moved through his expression. Not warmth, not exactly, but a kind of recalibration, like a man adjusting a calculation that had just returned an unexpected result. He said nothing more. He turned and walked toward the wagon. Amelia followed him. She did not look in the watching crowd. She did not look at the 2 women by the door. She looked at the back of Nate Whitmore's shoulders, and she thought, "I have worked for harder men than you. I have walked into worse rooms than this. You do not know me yet, and that is the only fact that matters right now." The ride to Blackthorn Ridge took 1 hour and 40 minutes. Nate sat up front with Frank holding the reins, with the practiced looseness of a man who has done something so many times it requires no thought. Amelia sat in the wagon bed with her luggage and with Caleb Moore, who was 19 years old, and so awkward in the presence of the silence between the boss and the new Mrs. Whitmore that he kept starting sentences and abandoning them partway through. "It's real nice country out this way, ma'am, once you get used to. Well, it's different from have you seen much of the sunsets are real." "What's your name?" Amelia asked. "Caleb, ma'am. Caleb Moore. I've been at Blackthorn Ridge going on 2 years now." "How old are you, Caleb?" 19, ma'am." "Do you like the work?" Caleb seemed genuinely surprised by the question, as though no one had asked him this before. He thought about it. "Yes, ma'am. The cattle work I like fine. He glanced toward the front of the wagon. "Other parts are sometimes difficult." "What other parts?" He lowered his voice slightly. "It's been hard since Pete's back gave out. He was the cook. Now we eat whatever whoever's least terrible at cooking puts together, which lately has been mostly Harris, and Harris is a kind man, but the things he does to beans ought to be illegal." Harris from somewhere said, "I heard that, Caleb." I meant you to, Caleb said. Amelia almost smiled. She kept her face composed, but it was a near thing. I can cook, she said. Caleb looked at her like she had just offered him something he had forgotten to want. When the wagon crested the final ridge and Blackthorn Ridge Ranch came into view, Amelia looked at it without speaking. The main house was large, larger than she had expected. 2 full stories of dark timber with a deep porch running the length of the front. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse corrals, a smokehouse, a structure she guessed was used for storage. There were horses in the paddock and cattle visible in the distance, and the evidence of industry everywhere she looked. It was in every material sense a prosperous and substantial ranch. It was also clearly and immediately a place where no one had been paying attention to the house itself for a very long time. Amelia noticed it the way she noticed most things, not as a judgment, but as an inventory. The porch needed repair in 2 places she could see from here. There was equipment left out that should have been put away. The garden plot beside the house had been abandoned to weeds. Inside was worse. The kitchen was the first room she looked at, because it was the most important room on a working ranch, and because its condition would tell her everything she needed to know about how things had been managed here. The kitchen told her things had not been managed here at all. Supplies were stored without system flour, mixed in with hardware equipment, salt and sugar unlabeled and side by side. A pantry that held 3 of some things and none of others. A firebox that hadn't been properly cleaned in weeks. A work surface that wanted scrubbing pots, that wanted organization. A complete absence of any record keeping that would have told you what you had and what you needed and what you had spent. Amelia stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of it. Nate appeared behind her. It's not what you're used to, he said. There might have been something slightly defensive in his voice, or she might have been imagining it. What was I used to? She asked. He paused. A proper kitchen, a woman's space. The kitchen I grew up in, Amelia said, moving into the room and beginning to open cabinets with the calm efficiency of a woman who has made up her mind about something. Was the back room of a farmhouse that was one bad harvest from being sold. I learned to cook on a stove that only worked on one side. What I'm used to, Mr. Whitmore, is making do. She looked back at him over her shoulder. This is not making do. This is a kitchen with real equipment and real supplies, and nobody taking care of either, that I can fix. Nate was quiet for a moment. The ceremony, he said finally. The pastor comes Thursday. All right. You're not... He stopped. I'm not what? You're not what I expected. Amelia turned and looked at him fully. You said you thought they sent the wrong woman. I did say that. And now, Nate Whitmore looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she could not read. Not cold exactly, but not warm either. Somewhere in the specific middle distance, where a man keeps his real thoughts when he has not yet decided whether to say them. And now, he said slowly, I'm reserving judgment. Amelia nodded once. That's fair. She turned back to the kitchen and began to work. She started with the pantry. She worked through the afternoon, taking everything out, making a list of what was present and in what quantity, identifying what was expired and what was not, organizing what was useful and setting aside what wasn't. She found a ledger in the back of one cabinet that might once have been used for supply tracking and might equally have been used to press flowers and then abandoned. Either way, it was empty and unused, and she appropriated it for her own purposes. She cataloged everything. 4 pounds of flour approximately 2 weeks old, half a sack of cornmeal, 3 tins of lard, a quantity of dried beans that had been stored without checking for insects. She found insects. She threw out the beans and made a note to order more. Salt and sugar in unmarked containers, side by side, identical in appearance, which explained she suspected a great many of the complaints about the recent cooking. She labeled everything. She reorganized the pantry from the ground-up staples at front and center, where they could be found without searching preserves, organized by type and by date. Hardware and cleaning supplies moved out of the food storage entirely because they had absolutely no business being there. Nate's housekeeper, a taciturn Mexican woman named Rosa, who came in 3 mornings a week to clean the main house, appeared in the kitchen doorway, mid-afternoon, and looked at Amelia with an expression that contained equal measures of wariness and curiosity. "You are the new wife," Rosa said. "I am Amelia Harper, yes. You are cleaning the pantry." "I am organizing the pantry. It needed doing." Rosa looked at the neat stacks, the labeled jars, the cleared and scrubbed shelves, and then looked at Amelia. "Mr. Whitmore does not like things moved," she said. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't cook supper for 20 men, Amelia said pleasantly. "I'll make sure he knows where things are." Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The floor in front of the stove is uneven. You have to put the front left leg on the folded piece of leather, or the pots slide." "Thank you," Amelia said. "That's useful." Rosa nodded once and withdrew. By the time the sun was beginning to descend toward the western ridge, Amelia had a kitchen she could work in. She could not fix everything in an afternoon. She knew that. But she could make supper. She could do that tonight with what she had, and she could do it properly. She went out to the smokehouse and found a quantity of cured pork that was being kept in conditions that were adequate but not optimal, and selected what she needed. She found dried herbs that had been stored without thought for what went with what she would address that later. She found onions and potatoes, and in the cool cellar below the kitchen, enough root vegetables to work with. She started a stock. She made bread. The smell of bread moving through a house does something to the people in it. Amelia had known this since she was 8 years old, watching her mother bake on Saturday mornings in the farmhouse outside Columbus, watching her father come in from whatever he had been doing outside and stop in the kitchen doorway with exactly that expression, the one where a person doesn't know they've relaxed until they already have. She was banking on the smell of bread. The ranch hands began to drift toward the main house around the time the light went golden, the way they always drifted toward supper, which had lately meant hovering around the kitchen doorway with the specific low-grade apprehension of men who had learned not to expect much. Caleb Moore was first. He appeared in the doorway and stopped. The kitchen smelled like bread, and like simmering stock, and like the particular combination of herbs and slow-cooked meat that registers somewhere in the body. Below the level of thought, something older than memory, something that says someone is taking care of you tonight. "That's," Caleb started. "Go wash your hands," Amelia said without looking up. "And tell the others supper will be on the table in 20 minutes. There was a pause. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb said. And there was something in his voice that made Amelia press her lips together and keep her eyes on the pot, because she recognized that tone. She had heard it from her brothers when they were young, and the farm was hard, and she had managed to make a real meal out of almost nothing, and they came into the kitchen, and something in them unwound that had been wound tight without anyone noticing. She did not allow herself to feel too much about it. Not yet. The supper table at Blackthorn Ridge seated 20, and had apparently been set with the casual indifference of men who were not expecting anything worth sitting properly for. Amelia went through the dining room before calling the hands in, straightening. What needed straightening? Adding the small things that cost nothing, but said something: a cloth on the table, the bread set out where it could be reached without someone having to ask for it. She put everything on the table herself. Warm bread, fresh from the oven. A stew that had been cooking long enough to mean it thick and properly seasoned with meat that had been treated with respect and vegetables that still had texture. Cornbread she had put together from what she found because the flour was there, and the lard was there, and she had learned to make cornbread under conditions that made this kitchen look like paradise. She filled the water pitcher and set it at the end of the table. Then she rang the bell. The ranch hands came in. They came in the way men come to a table when they are not expecting much, gradually, without hurry, with the muted anticipation of people who have calibrated their hopes downward to protect themselves from disappointment. Some of them glanced at her sideways. A few nodded. They sat down, and then they saw what was on the table. The room went quiet. Not the awkward quiet of men who don't know what to say. A different kind of quiet. The kind that falls when something has been given that wasn't expected, and the receiving of it takes a moment to understand. Frank Dawson, who had been at Blackthorn Ridge for 15 years and had seen the table through every version of what had passed for supper in that time, pulled the bread toward him and broke a piece and put it in his mouth and chewed slowly with an expression on his face that Amelia did not look at directly because she knew if she looked at it, she would not be able to maintain her composure. Nate sat at the head of the table. He watched. He had come in last, as was his custom, and he sat now at the head of the table and looked at what was in front of him, and then looked down the table at the 20 men who were eating with a quietness that was the opposite of the usual restless noise of supper, and he picked up his spoon. The stew was good. It was simply and straightforwardly good, in the way that food is good when it has been made with both skill and attention, and eating it produced the particular combination of physical satisfaction and something more complicated that is the specific gift of a meal that was cooked by someone who cared how it turned out. Halfway through the meal, Frank set down his spoon and looked at the middle of the table for a moment. Then he said quietly enough that only the men closest to him could hear, "I don't remember the last time supper felt like this." Harris beside him said nothing, but he nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he agrees with something he doesn't entirely have the words for. Amelia in the kitchen heard none of this. She was already making a list of what she needed to order from town. The ceremony on Thursday was brief. Pastor Elias Davies came out from Red Willow on a horse that was too old for the distance and performed the requisite words in the front parlor of the main house with Frank Dawson and Rosa as witnesses. Nate said his part. Amelia said hers. Afterward, Nate shook the pastor's hand and walked him back to his horse, and that was the end of the wedding ceremony of Nathaniel and Amelia Whitmore. There was no reception. There was no celebration. There was supper because there was always supper, and Amelia made it good because she had decided that this was the thing she could control, and she would control it. In the week that followed, she continued what she had begun. She pulled the supply ledger she'd claimed and started using it in earnest, tracking what came in from town, noting the dates and the prices and the quantities, cross-referencing against what was used, because a kitchen that fed 20 men every day went through a predictable amount of staples, and she intended to know exactly how much she was working with at every moment. The supply delivery came from a merchant named Harlan Burge, who operated out of Red Willow, and who had apparently been supplying Blackthorn Ridge for going on 3 years. The first delivery Amelia received, she checked everything against the invoice. It did not match. She checked again carefully, going through every item. There were 3 items on the invoice for which there was no corresponding delivery. Not large amounts: a sack of flour, a quantity of salt, a tin of lard. But they were there on the paper and not on the wagon, which meant that either Harlan Berg was making consistent errors, or Harlan Berg was charging for things he did not deliver. Amelia wrote the discrepancy in her ledger. She said nothing to anyone. She waited for the next delivery. The next delivery had 4 discrepancies. She said nothing. She wrote them down. The delivery after that, she was waiting on the porch when the wagon came in. She went through every item on the invoice, against every item on the wagon methodically, while Harlan Berge's delivery man stood beside the wagon with the expression of a man who was not used to this level of scrutiny and did not particularly enjoy it. When she was done, she had a list of 5 discrepancies. She handed the list to the delivery man. "I'll need these items delivered before you leave," she said pleasantly. "Or I'll need the invoice adjusted, whichever Mr. Burge prefers." The delivery man looked at the list. He looked at Amelia. He was a young man, perhaps 23, and he appeared to be doing the specific mental calculation of whether this woman was going to be a consistent problem. Amelia looked at him with the patient, even expression of a woman who had been doing the mental arithmetic on difficult situations since she was 19 years old, and had learned that patience was a more effective weapon than anger in nearly every case. "I'll take this back to Mr. Burge," the delivery man said. "Please do," Amelia said. "And while you're there, you might let him know that I'll be auditing the previous 3 years of invoices with the records we have on hand, just so he has that information." The delivery man left without another word. Amelia went back inside and continued making bread. She did not mention any of this to Nate. Not yet. She did not have the full picture yet, and she had learned early that an incomplete accusation was a wasted accusation. You brought what you could prove, or you brought nothing. She was building towards something she could prove. In the meantime, she learned the ranch. She learned it the way she learned everything, systematically, and without announcing that she was doing it. She asked questions of the men who were willing to answer them, and she listened, and she remembered everything. She learned that the north pasture flooded in spring, and that 2 of the fence posts along the East Creek line were rotting out, and that the bunkhouse roof had a leak that had been patched twice and would need proper repair before winter. She learned which men had families in town, and which had no family at all, and which had skills outside their ranch work. Harris could do basic carpentry, it turned out, and young Caleb had a gift with horses that went beyond what his age suggested. She learned that Frank Dawson had worked for Nate through the full span of the difficult years through Clara's death and the hard winter of 1881, and a drought that had almost ended the ranch in 1883, and that Frank's loyalty to Nate was the uncomplicated and absolute loyalty of a man who respects the person he works for and has chosen to continue doing so through every hardship. She learned that Nate himself worked from before sunrise to well after dark, and ate whatever was put in front of him and slept. She suspected less than he should, and that the way he ran his ranch with an efficiency bordering on mechanical was the way he had run his life since 1879, substituting work for everything he had shut out. She did not say any of this to anyone. She stored it away and continued learning. 2 weeks in, she rode into Red Willow with Frank Dawson on the supply wagon. She needed to speak to the town's other merchants about alternative suppliers, which she had identified as a necessary step, regardless of what she eventually discovered about Harlan Burge's invoicing practices. The mercantile was run by a husband and wife named Colton and May Webb, and May Webb was the kind of woman Amelia had always respected. Sharp, experienced, and possessed of an absolute BS detector that had been honed over years of managing a business in a territory where the economy ran on trust, and the consequences of misplaced trust could be severe. May looked at Amelia across the counter. "You're Whitmore's wife," she said. "I am." "How's the ranch treating you?" Amelia considered this question. "The ranch is fine," she said. "The management of certain accounts is something I'm still working out." May's eyes went slightly sharper. "You talking about Harlan Burge?" Amelia said nothing. May leaned on the counter. "I'm asking because you're not the first person to have a conversation with me about Harlan Burge's invoicing practices. You're just the first person from Blackthorn Ridge." Amelia absorbed this. "How long?" "As long as he's been supplying the bigger ranches out this way." May looked at her steadily. "Most of the ranch wives or foremen check an invoice maybe once in 10 deliveries. Harlan knows that. He keeps the amount small enough that nobody thinks it's worth the argument." "I check every invoice," Amelia said. "I know you do," May said. "Henderson's delivery man came in here yesterday and said Whitmore's new wife had the Burge boy standing next to his wagon for 20 minutes, going through items one by one." She paused. He seemed unsettled. "Good," Amelia said. May Webb looked at her for a moment, with an expression that Amelia recognized. It was the look of one practical woman assessing another and finding the assessment satisfactory. "Let me know if I can help," May said simply. "I'll need to know what the fair market price is for the standard ranch supplies," Amelia said. "If you're willing." May pulled a ledger from under the counter. Amelia went home that afternoon with 3 pages of notes in her pocket and a clearer picture than she had started the day with. She went over the numbers that night in her room after supper, after the house had gone quiet by the light of the lamp on her desk. The discrepancies, when added up across the deliveries she had records for, were not small. And if Harlan Burge had been running this particular operation for 3 years, as May seemed to suggest then, the total amount extracted from Blackthorn Ridge was not a number that Nate Whitmore would look at without feeling it. Amelia organized her notes. She would need more time. She would need the older invoices if they existed, and she would need to go through them carefully and document everything in a way that was irrefutable. She was building a case. She did not know yet that she was also entirely without planning to building something else. 3 weeks into her time at Blackthorn Ridge, Nate came into the kitchen one evening after most of the hands had retired. He sat down at the kitchen table. This surprised her. He had not done this before. He generally moved through the kitchen with the specificity of a man who knows exactly what he came for and leaves when he has it. He sat down, and she put coffee in front of him, because coffee was what she would put in front of anyone sitting in that kitchen, and she was not going to modify that for Nate Whitmore. "Frank says the men are happier," Nate said. Amelia continued washing the last of the supper dishes. Frank says a lot of things. He does. Nate turned the coffee cup in his hands. He also says you've been auditing the supply invoices. I have. A pause. Find anything? Amelia turned and looked at him. This was the moment she decided. Not the full case, she didn't have the full case yet. But enough. Yes, she said. I've been documenting discrepancies between what Berg invoices and what he delivers. I have 3 months of records so far. The pattern is consistent. Nate was still for a moment. How much? Pure delivery, the amounts are small enough to overlook. Across 3 months based on what I've confirmed, roughly $12. Nate said nothing. But May Webb at the Mercantile says this has been happening as long as Berg has been supplying the larger ranches. If that's accurate, and if Blackthorn Ridge has been on his delivery route for 3 years... She paused. I don't want to give you a number I can't back up. I'm still going through the records, but it would be significant. Nate looked at her. There was something in his expression she had not seen before. Not surprise exactly. Something more complicated than surprise. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked. Because I wanted to be certain before I said anything. An accusation without proof isn't useful. He looked at his coffee cup, then back at her. What do you need to finish documenting it? The older invoices if they exist, and time. The older invoices are in the office. I'll show you where. He stood. And Amelia. She looked at him. Good work, he said. It was simple. It was direct. It was coming from Nate Whitmore, something close to remarkable. Amelia turned back to the dishes. Thank you, she said, and she allowed herself privately, with her hands in the warm water and the lamp burning steady on the counter. Exactly 1 moment of feeling something that was not quite contentment, but was in the same country. The feeling of a person who has found possibly not what she expected, but what she is capable of, and what that is worth. She turned back to the work. Because there was always more work. And Amelia Harper had never been afraid of work in her life. The older invoices were in a wooden crate in the corner of Nate's office, stacked without order beneath a layer of dust that suggested nobody had touched them in longer than anyone cared to admit. Nate showed her where they were on a Wednesday evening, pulled the crate out from the corner with one hand, and set it on the desk with a flat thud that sent a small cloud of dust into the lamplight. Everything from Berg should be in there, he said. Going back to when we first started using him. October of '82. Amelia looked at the crate. Then she looked at Nate. That's nearly 3 years, she said. Yes. All right. She pulled the crate closer and began lifting out the invoices in stacks, setting them on the desk in the order she intended to go through them. I'll need a few evenings. Nate watched her for a moment. She could feel him watching, not the way she had felt his eyes on her that first day on the platform, that weighing, uncertain look, but something different now. Something that was trying to understand something it wasn't sure it understood yet. I'll leave you to it, he said, and he went out. Amelia sat down and began to read. She worked 3 evenings in a row, 2 to 3 hours each night after supper was cleared, and the house had settled into its quiet rhythms. She built her ledger entry by invoice cross-referencing. Burge's stated prices against the fair market figures May Webb had given her, noting every shortfall in quantity, every inflated price point, every item billed twice under slightly different descriptions. By the end of the 3rd evening, she had a number. She sat with it for a moment. $214 over 2 years and 7 months. She wrote it in the ledger and underlined it once, and then sat back in Nate's office chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about what $214 meant to a man with a ranch as large as Blackthorn Ridge. Not ruin, not even close to ruin, but not nothing either. And the principle of it, the systematic patient confident theft of it, built on the assumption that nobody was paying enough attention to notice, that was something else entirely. She closed the ledger. She was going to tell Nate in the morning, but that night while she was carrying the lamp back to her room through the darkened hallway, she passed the parlor and found him still awake, sitting in the chair by the cold fireplace with a glass of whiskey. He didn't appear to be drinking, staring at whatever it is men stare at when they sit alone in dark rooms with their thoughts. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. $214, she said. He went very still. That's what Harlan Berg has taken from this ranch in the last 2 years and 7 months. She kept her voice level. I have documentation for all of it. Invoice by invoice, discrepancy by discrepancy. You can take it to any court in the territory, and it will hold. Nate said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, he's been doing this to other ranches too. Mae Webb at the Mercantile believes so. She'd know who. He's been doing it because nobody checked. There was something in Nate's voice that was quieter and more dangerous than anger. It was the sound of a man recalibrating how he had been trusting the world. 3 years. Nobody on this ranch checked. To be fair, Amelia said carefully, you didn't have anyone whose job it was to check. Nate looked at her. Until now, she added. He looked back at the cold fireplace. He set the whiskey glass down on the side table without having drunk from it. What do you want to do about it? He asked. That's your decision, she said. It's your ranch and your money and your relationship with Burge. I can give you everything documented. What you do with it is up to you. What would you do? Amelia considered this honestly. I would go to Burge directly first. Give him the chance to make it right quietly before involving anyone else. If he refuses or denies it, then you bring in the law. She paused. But I'd also be prepared for him to go to his friends before you go to yours. Men like Burge generally don't stand alone. Nate looked at her with an expression that she was slowly learning to read. Not quite wariness, not quite respect. Something that sat in the space between them and hadn't decided yet what it was going to become. You've done this before, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I've dealt with men who thought I wasn't paying attention, she said. Yes. He nodded once slowly. Good night, Mr. Whitmore, she said, and she continued down the hall to her room. She lay awake for a while, not because she was troubled, but because her mind was still running the numbers, still checking the columns, still turning over the question of what came next and what she needed to anticipate. She was not afraid. She realized with some surprise, something close to awake, in a way she hadn't been in a long time. The confrontation with Harlan Berge happened on a Friday morning. Nate rode into Red Willow alone. He had not told Amelia he was going, but Frank had, because Frank told Amelia most things he felt she ought to know, which was a habit that had developed naturally and without anyone deciding it would, the way most of the useful habits at Blackthorn Ridge seemed to develop since she'd arrived. Amelia was in the kitchen when Frank appeared in the doorway, with a look on his face that said he had something to say, and wasn't entirely sure he should say it. Boss rode into town, Frank said. I know. To see Burge. I know that too. Frank stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. Frank Dawson was a man of approximately 45, with the face of a man who had spent that entire 45 years outdoors, and he had a way of standing that conveyed both absolute steadiness and a readiness to move if something needed doing. He had been one of the first men to trust her, and she had not missed it. You're not worried, he asked. About Nate? No. She turned the bread she was making out onto the worktop. About Burge's reaction? A little. Men who've been comfortable doing something for years tend to react badly when someone calls them on it. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Burge has a brother-in-law who's a county commissioner. Amelia looked up. Just thought you should know, Frank said. She held his gaze. Thank you, Frank. He nodded and left. Amelia pressed the bread dough with the heel of her hand and thought about county commissioners and what they were generally useful for and what they were not. And then she thought about the documented ledger sitting in Nate's office and what $214 with complete and irrefutable documentation was worth in a territorial court versus what the opinion of a county commissioner was worth without it. She felt reasonably comfortable with that calculation. Nate came home in the early afternoon. He came into the kitchen, and she looked at him once and knew it had not gone cleanly. There was a set to his jaw that meant the morning had produced friction. She put coffee in front of him. He denied it, Nate said. Of course he did. Claimed the discrepancies were errors. His man's mistakes on the wagon. Said he'd look into it. Nate's hands were flat on the kitchen table. He was very calm about it, very reasonable, like a man who knows exactly how much trouble he's not in. Because he thinks he has cover, Amelia said. Nate looked at her. The commissioner brother-in-law, she said. Nate's expression shifted a brief, sharp look of something that might have been surprise if he'd allowed it to develop that far. Frank told you. Frank is thorough. Nate looked at his coffee. Berg as much as said that anything I brought to the county would be managed. He said the last word like it tasted wrong. Like that was just a fact I ought to understand and accept. He's made this calculation before, Amelia said. He knows what the county will and won't do, so we have nowhere to go. We have the territorial court, Amelia said. Nate looked at her. The county doesn't have jurisdiction over territorial commerce disputes above a certain threshold, she said. I looked into this when I started building the ledger. $214 across multiple documented transactions qualifies as territorial jurisdiction. The county commissioner has exactly no authority over that process. The silence in the kitchen was absolute for a moment. How do you know that? Nate said. I asked Mae Webb, and she asked her husband who practiced law in St. Louis before they came out here. Amelia picked up her coffee cup. It took about 20 minutes. Nate stared at her. The documentation I've built will hold in a territorial court, she continued. I've been careful to make sure of it. Invoice by invoice with fair market pricing cited and sourced, and signed by Mae Webb as a merchant of record in the county. She paused. Berg has the county. We have the territory. Those are not the same thing. Nate was still for a long moment. Then he said quietly, the way a man says something he means more than he's allowing himself to show, you planned for this. I planned for the possibility, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment with that expression again. The one she had started to understand as the face Nate Whitmore made when something had reached him that he was not yet ready to acknowledge. What do we do next? He asked. You write to the territorial court in Cheyenne, Amelia said. I'll draft the letter tonight, and in the meantime, you find a different supplier. I'll lose the county contract if I move away from Berg. He supplies the county operation too. You'll lose $214 a year and your dignity if you don't, Amelia said. Another silence. Then Nate said, draft the letter. She did. She wrote it that night at the desk in Nate's office, clear and organized and precise with the documented evidence summarized and annexed, and she wrote it in language that was firm without being inflammatory, because she had learned that inflammatory language gave people something to argue with, and she had no interest in giving Harlan Berg or his brother-in-law anything to argue with. She left it on Nate's desk. In the morning, he read it, made 2 small changes that were both improvements, and signed it. Frank wrote it into Red Willow to the post office before breakfast. The thing about a ranch is that it does not pause for any of this. The cattle needed tending. The horses needed feeding. The fence on the north pasture needed checking because one of the hands had reported a section that looked unstable, and unstable fence meant cattle on the wrong side of a territorial boundary, which meant a dispute with a neighbor, which was the last thing anyone needed on top of everything else. Life at Blackthorn Ridge continued at the pace of an operation that required the labor of 20 people to function, and Amelia moved through all of it with the same methodical steadiness she had brought to the pantry inventory in her first week. Only now she understood the ranch well enough that her steadiness was beginning to look less like competence and more like mastery. She knew which supplies ran low at what point in the month. She knew which men were likely to need extra feeding after a long day of cattle work versus a shorter repair day. She knew that Caleb Moore's birthday was coming up in 10 days because she had heard him mention it in passing, and she had written it in the margin of her ledger because she filed things like this, the same way she filed invoice discrepancies as information that would be useful eventually. She made a cake. It was a simple cake, and she made no announcement of it, and when she put it on the supper table on the evening of Caleb Moore's birthday, without saying why, the 19-year-old went very red and stared at it with an expression that made 2 of the older hands turn away to look at the wall for a moment. I don't nobody usually, Caleb started. Happy birthday, Caleb, Amelia said. Harris beside him clapped him on the shoulder. Frank Dawson cut the first piece. And at the head of the table, Nate Whitmore watched all of this with an expression that Amelia, who was pouring coffee and deliberately not watching him, could feel but did not look at. That night, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, Nate found her in the garden. She had begun to reclaim from the weeds that had taken it over in the years since Clara had stopped tending it. She had not asked permission to work in the garden. She had decided it needed doing, and she had started doing it in the early evenings when supper was finished and there was light left. Nate stood at the garden's edge and looked at what she'd done. It wasn't much yet. A cleared border, some beds turned, the old herb section rescued from the weeds that had consumed it. "Clara planted this," Nate said. Amelia looked up at him. "I know." "No," she said. "Rosa told me." He said nothing. "I can leave it," Amelia said, "if you'd rather." Nate was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the cleared border with an expression that she recognized, not because she had seen it on him before, but because she had seen it on her own face in windows and reflective surfaces after her mother died. The expression of a person standing at the edge of something they have been avoiding and feeling the full weight of the avoidance all at once. "She loved this garden," he said finally. The words came out like something he had been holding for a long time. "She talked about what she was going to plant in it every spring for 3 years before she had the time to actually do it. And then she did it. And then she was gone." Amelia set down the small trowel she had been using. "The herbs are still good," she said quietly. "They came back this year without anyone tending them. Rosemary and thyme and the sage she planted along the south edge. They survived." Nate looked at her. "Things that were well planted survive," Amelia said simply. "That's not nothing." He stood there for a moment longer, with the last of the light on him, and an expression she couldn't entirely read, and then he said, "Good night, Amelia," in a voice that was slightly different from the voice he usually used, and went back inside. She looked at the space where he had been standing. Then she picked up her trowel and continued working. The letter from Harlan Burge arrived 12 days after Nate's letter went to the territorial court. It was addressed to Nate, but Amelia was the one in the office when it came. Frank brought it to her because Frank had developed the sensible habit of routing things through Amelia when Nate was out on the ranch, and she set it on the desk and looked at it for a moment, and then went to find Nate. He read it standing up. He read it twice. "He's threatening to stop supplying the neighboring ranches if they don't refuse to deal with us," Nate said. "Is he?" Amelia had expected something of this nature. "He says he'll make sure any rancher who associates with Blackthorn Ridge has supply problems of their own." Nate set the letter down. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the thing beneath the control. Not rage exactly, but something close to it, the cold kind. "He's trying to isolate us." "He's scared," Amelia said. "Men who are confident don't make threats like this. They make them when they understand that what you've sent to Cheyenne is real, and they need everyone else to be as afraid as they are." "Henderson runs his operation 10 miles north of us," Nate said. "We share water rights on the creek. If Burge cuts him off and Henderson blames us." "Then we talk to Henderson before Burge does," Amelia said. Nate looked at her. "We go to Henderson today," she said. "Not tomorrow, today. We show him our documentation. We explain exactly what Burge has been doing and invite him to check his own invoices. Because I am willing to bet $214 that Burge has been doing the same thing to Henderson. And the moment Henderson understands that he is not going to be Burge's ally, he's going to be ours." Nate stared at her for a long 3 seconds. Then he said, "Get your coat." She had never been to the Henderson Ranch. It was smaller than Blackthorn Ridge, but well run, the kind of operation that showed in every detail that the person running it paid attention. Edmund Henderson met them in the yard with the wariness of a man who had received his own version of Harlan Burge's message and was not sure what to make of Whitmore arriving unannounced. Henderson was a practical man. That was immediately clear. Amelia introduced herself not as Nate's wife, not first, but as the person who had been auditing Blackthorn Ridge's supply accounts. She explained what she had found. She showed him her documented ledger. She explained the method, the small discrepancies per delivery, the pattern of consistent under-delivery on certain items, the inflation of prices on others. She watched Edmund Henderson's face. She watched him recognize what she was describing. Son of a Henderson caught himself. He looked at Amelia. Beg your pardon, ma'am. Don't apologize, she said. Tell me what you're thinking. I'm thinking that I have 3 years of invoices in my own office that I have never once gone through line by line, Henderson said. Because I trusted the man. His jaw set. I trusted the man. Most people did, Amelia said. He relied on that. Henderson looked at Nate. You've sent documentation to Cheyenne. We have, Nate said. I want to be on that correspondence. That's why we're here, Nate said. On the ride home, the late afternoon turning the plains to deep gold around them. Nate rode beside her in silence for several miles. Then he said, You knew he'd have been hit too. I suspected, she said. It was a logical extension of the pattern. You turned a man who could have been our problem into our ally in 40 minutes. How was never going to be our problem, Amelia said. He was going to be Burge's problem once he understood what had been happening. I just needed to make sure he understood it from us first. Nate looked at her. She looked back at him because she had nothing to hide and had never had anything to hide. And she found that looking Nate Whitmore directly in the eye was getting easier rather than harder as the weeks passed. What made you look at the invoices in the first place? He asked. First week you were here. You came in, you organized the pantry, and then you started checking the invoices. Why? Amelia thought about this honestly. Because they were there, she said. And because in my experience, money that isn't being watched tends to move toward the person who's watching it. That's not cynicism, it's just arithmetic. Nate was quiet. My father trusted people, she said. Not bitterly, just as a fact. He was a good man, and he trusted people. And there were 2 men in Columbus who took advantage of that trust, and when he died, there was almost nothing left. I promised myself at 19 that I would always watch the numbers. She paused. It has been a useful promise. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortably. I said something to you on the platform in Red Willow, Nate said finally. You did. I was wrong to say it. She looked at him. You were working from incomplete information. That's generous. It's accurate, she said. You'd never met me. All you had was what the agency told you. And I was... She paused and let herself be fair about it. I was not what you expected. No, he said quietly. You weren't. The light was fading. The ranch was visible in the middle distance, the dark timber of the main house solid against the evening sky. What did you expect? She asked. Howe was quiet for a long moment, and she thought he might not answer. Someone easier, he said finally. Someone I could manage the way I manage the rest of this ranch. Put in the right place, and leave to do what she was put there to do. And instead you got someone who reorganized your pantry and started auditing your accounts without being asked, she said. Something moved across his face that was very close to being a smile. Yes. I'm sorry to be an inconvenience. You're not, he said. That's the part I'm still working out. She let that settle without comment. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, and it was a different silence than any that had existed between them before. Not the stiff, careful silence of 2 strangers trying not to impose on each other's space, but something with more air in it. Something that felt like the beginning of a room that 2 people might eventually both want to be in. That evening at supper, something happened that she had not anticipated. Frank Dawson, who was not a man who made speeches, stood up from the table before anyone had finished eating and looked down at his plate for a moment and then looked at Amelia. I want to say something, he said. The table went quiet. Frank was not a man you ignored when he stood up to say something. 15 years at Blackthorn Ridge had given him a particular kind of authority that was different from Nate's authority. Not the authority of ownership, but the authority of someone who has outlasted every difficulty the place had offered and keeps showing up anyway. I've been on this ranch since before most of you were working cattle, Frank said. I've eaten at this table through some good years, and some years I'd rather not think about. He paused. We haven't had a proper supper at this table in a long time. Not the kind where a man sits down and feels like a person. He looked at Amelia, and his voice was steady and simple, and completely unperformed. You did that. And whatever else goes on with Berg and the courts and all the rest of it, I wanted to say it where everyone could hear it. The table was very still. Young Caleb Moore was staring at his plate. Harris, who cried at almost nothing and had the dignity to never admit it, was looking fixedly at the window. Amelia sat with her hands around her coffee cup and held very still and breathed carefully. "Thank you, Frank," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. Frank sat down. Nate said nothing. But Amelia did not look at him because she could feel without looking what his face was doing, and she knew that the thing moving through him in that moment was not something he was ready to have witnessed. She respected that. She had learned in 6 weeks at Blackthorn Ridge that Nathaniel Whitmore was a man of great capacity who had spent years making himself smaller than he was, because being large enough to feel things meant being large enough to lose them, and that was a form of fear she understood, because she had her own version of it, and she was not going to crowd him while he stood in it. She would be here. She would cook the supper, and check the invoices, and pull the weeds from Clara Whitmore's garden, and wait. She was good at waiting. She had been patient her entire life, and she was still standing, and the arithmetic of that, she thought, was probably the most important calculation she had ever run, across the table and the far end. Nate Whitmore lifted his coffee cup and drank from it, and looked at nothing in particular, with an expression that only she of everyone in that room was close enough to have read correctly. He was afraid. Not of Berg, not of the courts, not of the work, of this, of the warmth of this room, and the fact that he had started against every wall he had built to depend on it, and Amelia Harper, who understood something about the difference between walls and foundations, let the supper table conversation wash over her and made a quiet and private decision. She was not going anywhere. Not because she had nowhere else to go. Because she had decided some evening between the pantry inventory and the invoice ledger and Clara Whitmore's surviving herbs in the dark garden that she was going to be the thing at Blackthorn Ridge that lasted. And Amelia Harper had never once in her life made a promise she didn't intend to keep. The response from Cheyenne came on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Nate's letter had gone out, and it arrived not alone, but with a second letter tucked inside the same envelope, a formal acknowledgement from the territorial court clerk, stating that 2 additional complainants had already filed similar documentation against Harlan Berg within the past 18 months, and that the court was now treating the matter as a pattern of commercial fraud rather than an isolated dispute. Amelia read both letters standing at Nate's desk. She read them twice. Then she set them down carefully and walked out to the corral where Nate was working a young horse through its paces, and she waited at the fence until he saw her face and knew immediately that something had happened. He handed the lead rope to Caleb without a word and came to her. She gave him the letters. He read them. She watched his jaw tighten and then deliberately release the way a man controls a physical reaction that he has decided is not useful. 2 others, he said. At least 2 who filed formally. May Webb said she believed there were more who hadn't. So he's been running this operation across the whole territory, and the county covered it every time because of the commissioner. Nate folded the letters with a precision that suggested he was managing something. Until someone actually sent documentation to Cheyenne instead of complaining to the county. Until someone checked the invoices, Amelia said. He looked at her. Just for a moment. Then he looked back at the letters. The court wants a representative present at a hearing in 6 weeks, he said. In Cheyenne. I know. That means one of us goes, or we send someone we trust. I'll go, Amelia said. Nate looked up sharply. Amelia, I built the ledger, she said. I know every line of that documentation. I can answer questions about it that you couldn't, not because you're not capable, but because I was the one sitting in that office for 3 evenings cross-referencing every invoice. Nobody knows this case better than I do. She paused. And you can't leave the ranch for 3 days when the north pasture fence is still compromised and calving season starts in 5 weeks. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running through the counter-arguments and finding that each one was less sound than the one before it. Frank goes with you, he said finally. Of course. And you take my name on the formal representation documents, as my authorized agent. That would carry more legal weight, yes. Then that's how we do it. He handed the letters back to her. His fingers brushed hers in the a brief accidental contact, and neither of them acknowledged it. But Amelia was aware of it for the rest of the afternoon, in the particular way you are aware of the things that happen in the space between what is said and what is felt. The news that Blackthorn Ridge had sent documentation to the territorial court against Harlan Burge reached Red Willow within 2 days. In a town of 400 people, there was no such thing as a private legal action. By the following Monday, when Amelia drove the supply wagon into town for the week's provisions from the Webb's Mercantile, now which had become her consistent supplier, and from a second merchant named Gruber, who carried hardware and dry goods, she could feel the shift in the street before she had stepped down from the wagon. It was the particular quality of attention that a small town turns on someone it has decided to form an opinion about. She tied the horse at the post in front of the Mercantile, and a woman she recognized from the Sunday services she had attended twice since her arrival. A rancher's wife named Patricia Caldwell, wife of the largest neighboring landowner. Charles Caldwell was standing on the boardwalk with 2 other women, and the conversation they had been having stopped with a specificity that made it clear Amelia had been its subject. Patricia Caldwell was a woman of perhaps 50, dressed in the manner of someone who spent considerable effort communicating through clothing that she was a woman of consequence. She looked at Amelia with the careful measuring look of someone who had already decided what she was looking at and was simply confirming the decision. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. The title was courteous enough. The tone beneath it was not. "Mrs. Caldwell," Amelia said. "Good morning. We were just speaking about the business with Harlan Burge." Patricia's voice was smooth and social and contained about as much warmth as the January ground. "Charles says it's a shame a thing like that going to the territorial court. Harlan's been supplying this county for years. Whatever the disagreement, these things are better handled locally." "These things are better handled correctly," Amelia said pleasantly. "The county had 2 years to handle it correctly." A small silence. One of the women beside Patricia inhaled sharply. "I suppose," Patricia said, "that a woman new to Wyoming has a great deal of opinions about how things ought to be handled." "I have one opinion," Amelia said. "That $214 belongs to my husband's ranch and not to Harlan Burge's pocket. The rest I leave to the court." She smiled the way her mother had taught her to smile at people who were being unkind with genuine warmth that gave them absolutely nothing to grip. "Excuse me, I have provisions to collect." She went into the Mercantile. May Webb was behind the counter. She had very clearly heard every word of the exchange through the open door. "Patricia Caldwell," May said, not as a question. "Patricia Caldwell," Amelia confirmed. "Her husband and Burge have been friends since before half this county was settled." May pulled Amelia's pre-ordered supplies from the shelf behind her. "Charles Caldwell doesn't like things that upset his arrangements. And you have very significantly upset his arrangements." "I haven't done anything to Caldwell's arrangements," Amelia said. "I've done something to Burge's. Charles Caldwell's arrangements and Burge's arrangements are the same arrangements," May said simply. "Burge supplies Caldwell at rates that don't appear in any invoice I've ever seen. The kind of rate a man gets when he's been useful to someone powerful for a long time." Amelia was still for a moment. "You're telling me Caldwell has been getting preferential pricing in exchange for the county protection?" "I'm telling you nothing officially," May said. "Officially, I'm just a merchant who sells dry goods and knows everybody's business because they all buy their dry goods from me." She met Amelia's eyes. "But yes." Amelia thought about this. "So when this goes to the territorial court and Burge's operation is examined in detail, the preferential pricing will come out," May said, "and whatever arrangement lies underneath it. And Caldwell knows that. Caldwell has known it since the day your letter went to Shen." May set the last of the supplies on the counter. "He has been very unhappy for approximately 3 weeks. Amelia paid for the supplies and carried them to the wagon herself, and on the ride home through the wide Wyoming afternoon, she turned all of this over in her mind with the methodical patience she brought to ledger work. Charles Caldwell was not Harlan Burge. Burge was a small opportunistic thief operating on the confidence that no one was watching closely enough to stop him. Caldwell was something larger and more deliberately constructed, a man who had spent years building a web of mutual benefit and mutual protection, and who had every reason to be hostile to anyone who pulled a thread. She was going to need to know more, She went to Frank that evening after supper. She found him in the barn, doing what Frank often did in the late evenings, checking on the horses with the particular attentiveness of a man for whom animals were more reliable company than people, which Amelia had found was a characteristic of the best ranch hands, the ones who stayed. "Tell me about Charles Caldwell," she said. Frank didn't look up from the horse he was examining. "What specifically?" "Everything you think I need to know and haven't told me yet." Frank was quiet for a moment. He ran his hand along the horse's flank thoughtfully. "Caldwell came to this county about 10 years back," he said. "Bought up land fast, which people could do then, if they had the money, and weren't particular about where the money came from. He's got 3 times as much acreage as we do, runs twice. The cattle has a hand in the county commission, and has a general policy of believing that what's good for Caldwell is what's good for Wyoming." "And Nate's relationship with him?" "Cordial," Frank said. "The way a man is cordial with a neighbor he doesn't trust but has no immediate reason to confront. They share water rights on the South Creek, and they've managed it without incident, but it's the kind of management that requires both parties to stay very careful." "Has Caldwell ever tried to take the water rights?" "He suggested a renegotiation 2 years back. Nate refused. The conversation ended there." Frank paused. "Caldwell doesn't push a thing if he thinks he'll lose the push. He's patient. He waits for a better angle." Amelia understood. "The Berg situation gives him an angle," she said. Frank finally looked at her. "If he can make it look like you drove a good local businessman out of the county with an outside legal action, if he can make Nate look like he's causing trouble in the community, instead of responding to being robbed, then the renegotiation conversation about the water rights has a different starting point." "Because Nate would be isolated." "Because Nate would be isolated," Frank confirmed. "And an isolated man is a man who negotiates from weakness." Amelia looked at the horse for a moment. The horse looked back at her with the calm, brown-eyed gravity of an animal that had no opinion about county politics. "How long have you known all this?" she asked. "I've known the pieces for years," Frank said. "I didn't know how they connected until you started pulling on the Berg thread, and I watched Caldwell's reaction." He paused. "You see a ranch different when you're looking at the money instead of the cattle." "That's a generous way to put it," she said. "It's an accurate one." Frank turned back to the horse. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find out what Caldwell's arrangement with Berg actually looks like in writing," she said. "Because if it looks the way May Webb thinks it does, it belongs in the Cheyenne hearing right alongside our invoices." Frank was quiet for a long moment. "That's a bigger fight than the Berg thing." "I know." "Nate might not want that fight." "Nate is going to want to know what I find," she said. "And then he'll decide." She told Nate that night. She sat down at the kitchen table across from him after the house had gone quiet, and she laid out everything May Webb's account of the preferential pricing. Frank's reading of Caldwell's motive, the connection between protecting Berg and positioning for the water rights renegotiation. Nate listened without interrupting. This was something she had come to appreciate about him when he was receiving information. He considered important. He gave it his complete attention and did not fill the space with his own reactions until he had heard all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You're telling me this was never just about Berg," he said. "I'm telling you Berg was the opportunity Caldwell was using. I don't know yet if Caldwell knew what Berg was doing to us specifically, or if he just knew in general that Berg ran his accounts in a way that required county protection. Either way, protecting Berg from Cheyenne protects whatever Caldwell has been getting from Berg," Nate said. He was working through it at the speed of a man who understood exactly what was being described. "And weakening us in this community is how he creates the pressure for the water rights." "Yes." "So when I go to the town meeting next week, Caldwell is going to use it," Amelia said. "He'll make a public case that we've overreached, that we've hurt a local businessman with an outside legal action when we could have settled things locally. He'll position himself as defending the community, and he'll use whatever social pressure he has to make people believe it." Nate looked at her directly. "And you know this because it's what I would do," she said, "if I were him and I needed to control the narrative before the Cheyenne hearing." The silence in the kitchen had a particular weight to it. "What do we do?" Nate said. We go to the town meeting, Amelia said. We bring the documentation, and we don't let him control what the room knows before we have a chance to say it. Nate looked at her for a long moment. You're going to speak at the meeting, he said. It was not a question. If you're willing, she said. The documentation is mine. I can present it more completely than anyone else can. He nodded once. Then you speak. The night before the town meeting, Amelia could not sleep. She lay in the dark in her room and ran through what she intended to say, the way she had run through the invoice columns in the early weeks, methodically line by line, anticipating where the numbers might be challenged, and preparing the answer before the challenge came. She was not afraid of speaking in public. She had spoken to creditors at 19 with her father's debt in her hands and no safety beneath her, and she had held her voice steady through all of it. She could hold it steady tomorrow. What she was turning over in the dark was something different. She was thinking about Nate, not strategically. Just thinking about him the way you think about someone when the practical calculations have quieted down and there is nothing left but the truth of a thing. She had been at Blackthorn Ridge for 8 weeks. In that time she had reorganized a kitchen, documented a fraud, cultivated an alliance with a neighboring rancher, built a legal case that was now being reviewed in Cheyenne, and reclaimed a garden that a dead woman had planted and a living man had not been able to bring himself to tend. She had done all of this because she was capable of it, and because it needed doing. But somewhere in the middle of all of it, something had shifted that she had not planned for and was not entirely sure what to do with. She had started to care how it went, not in the abstract sense of caring about her work. She had always cared about her work. That was not new. She cared how it went for him, for Nate specifically. She noticed when he was tired in a way that went beyond physical. She noticed when he passed the garden in the evenings and slowed down just slightly before he moved on. She noticed the way he sat at the head of the supper table in recent weeks, with something slightly less rigid in his posture, the way a man sits when a room has become familiar enough that his body has stopped bracing for something. She noticed all of this, the way she noticed invoice discrepancies precisely and with full awareness of what she was doing and without any certainty about what to do with the information. She was his wife in the legal sense of the word. They had said the words in front of Pastor Davies, and they were listed as such in the county records, and she cooked his household's food and managed his ranch's accounts and slept under his roof. They had never once used the word love. She was not sure either of them was ready to use it. But she lay in the dark, and she thought about the way his fingers had brushed hers, passing the letters, and the way he had said, "You're not what I expected" on the road home from Henderson's ranch, and the way he had looked at her in the kitchen after Frank's speech at the supper table, like a man looking at something he had been afraid of wanting, and was only just beginning to admit that he wanted anyway. She pulled her blanket up and closed her eyes. One thing at a time, she told herself. Tomorrow, the meeting, everything else after. She slept. The Red Willow Town Hall was a single large room that served as meeting space, occasional courtroom, and community gathering place with equal impartiality. On the evening of the monthly town meeting, it was full in a way that suggested word had gotten around about what the agenda contained, which in Red Willow it always had, because the agenda was never actually the surprise. Amelia and Nate arrived together. Frank walked 2 steps behind them, which was where Frank always positioned himself in situations he considered potentially requiring intervention. And Caleb Moore was beside him because Caleb had asked to come, and Nate had said yes without asking why, which Amelia thought was evidence of something good about Nate's instincts. The room watched them walk in. Amelia felt every eye and acknowledged none of them. She kept her shoulders level and her chin at a neutral angle, not defiant, not deferential, simply present, and she walked to a seat near the front because she was not going to sit in the back of any room where she intended to speak. Charles Caldwell was already there. She had not seen him in person before. He was a large man, well-dressed by Wyoming standards, with the kind of settled, comfortable authority of a man who had spent so many years being the most powerful person in a room that he no longer thought about it consciously. He held his position at the front of the room, the way a mountain holds its position, not aggressively, but with an absolute assumption of permanence. He looked at Amelia when she walked in. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. The meeting ran through its ordinary business water table, concerns a road repair proposal, the ongoing question of a second school teacher, and Amelia sat through all of it with perfect patience, listening carefully, noting the room's relationships, in the same way she noted everything without judgment, but with complete attention. When the Burge matter came up, Caldwell rose without waiting to be asked. How was Smooth? She had expected that. He spoke in the reasonable, measured tones of a man who had spent years practicing the art of sounding like the voice of common sense. I think we all understand that Harlan Berg is not a perfect businessman, Caldwell said. There may well have been errors in his accounting. Errors happen. But this community has had a relationship with Harlan for years, and sending a legal action to the territorial court, bypassing our own county process, is the kind of thing that damages how business gets done out here. He looked around the room with the ease of a man who has looked around many rooms and generally liked what he saw. The question I'd ask is whether one ranch's grievance is worth the disruption to all our arrangements. Several heads nodded. Amelia watched them nod and felt the temperature of the room and understood precisely what Caldwell was doing. He was making this about community loyalty versus outside interference, and he was doing it well, and if she let him finish defining the terms of this conversation, it would not be recoverable. She stood up. Caldwell was still speaking. He glanced at her. He did not stop. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. Her voice was clear and completely level. He paused. The room turned to look at her. "I'll let you finish," she said with the specific courtesy that is more pointed than rudeness. "I just want to make sure the room knows that I have documentation with me, and I'd like the opportunity to share it when you're done." A beat. "Of course," Caldwell said. He smiled at her with the controlled warmth of a man conceding a small point to protect a large one. "Mrs. Whitmore," he finished. He sat. Amelia walked to the front of the room. She had her ledger. She also had a second document she had prepared the previous evening, a clean, organized summary, written clearly enough that anyone in the room could follow it without any particular financial knowledge. She set both on the table at the front. "I want to address something Mr. Caldwell said," she began. "He said there may have been errors in Mr. Burge's accounting. I want to show you what those errors looked like." She opened the summary. She walked the room through it. Not quickly, with the patient, precise clarity of someone who has organized this information so thoroughly that she could present it in her sleep. She named amounts. She named dates. She named the specific pattern, the small, consistent, never quite large enough to notice discrepancies that only became visible when someone sat down and looked at all of them at once. The room was very quiet. "The reason this went to the territorial court rather than the county," she said, "is that this pattern has been occurring across multiple ranches in this territory for years." She paused. 2 other ranches had already sent documentation to Cheyenne before ours arrived. The territorial court is treating this as a pattern of commercial fraud, not an isolated error. A murmur moved through the room. "I'd also like to address something else," she said. She looked at Caldwell directly, and she said it in the same calm, factual tone she had used for everything else, because she had learned that the most effective way to say a difficult thing was to say it as though it were simply true, which in this case it was. "There is information in the documentation sent to Cheyenne regarding the pricing arrangements between Mr. Burge and certain of his larger clients. Arrangements that appear to involve preferential rates not available to other customers. The court is aware of this and has indicated it will be examined as part of the proceeding." The room went absolutely still. Caldwell did not move. His expression did not change. He was a man of considerable control, and he exercised it completely in that moment. But Amelia watched his hands, which had been resting openly on his thighs when he sat down, and which were now very slightly tighter than they had been. "What are you implying, Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. Smooth, very smooth. "I'm not implying anything," she said. "I'm describing what the territorial court has told us is in the documentation. What it means is for the court to determine." She looked at him steadily. "I expect you'll receive your own correspondence from Cheyenne shortly if you haven't already." The silence stretched. Then Frank Dawson stood up. He stood up, the way Frank Dawson stood in every situation, without drama, without hurry, with the uncomplicated solidity of a man who has decided something and is simply acting on the decision. I've been at Blackthorn Ridge for 15 years, Frank said, addressing the room rather than any one person. I want to be real clear about something. Mrs. Whitmore didn't come to this ranch and start trouble. She came and found trouble that was already here. The difference is that she was the first person paying close enough attention to see it. A beat of silence. Then Edmund Henderson, who had quietly taken a seat near the back of the room without Amelia noticing his arrival, rose to his feet. I've been through my own invoices, Henderson said. 3 years' worth. The numbers match what Mrs. Whitmore described. The same pattern, the same method. He looked around the room. I signed on to the Cheyenne correspondence last week. The room shifted. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the particular movement of a group of people in the process of reconsidering a position they had not fully committed to, yet a gradual turning of the current like water, finding a different direction. Caldwell stood. This is, he began, and his voice was still controlled, still reasonable, but there was something beneath the control now that had not been there before. A series of accusations that, they're not accusations, Amelia said. He stopped. An accusation is something you offer without evidence, she said. What I brought tonight is documentation. Every number in that ledger is sourced and dated and verified. The difference matters. She looked at him. And Charles Caldwell, who had spent 10 years being the most powerful voice in every room he entered, looked back at her across a Red Willow town hall that had gone completely silent and said nothing. Nate had not spoken for the entirety of the meeting. He had not needed to. But as people began to rise, and the room started to break apart into the small, urgent conversations that follow a meeting where something actual has happened, he stood up from his seat, and he looked at the room, and he said clearly enough that the people still filtering out could hear it. My wife has done more to protect this ranch in 8 weeks than I managed to see in 3 years. Anyone in this room who has questions about her character or her place here is welcome to come to Blackthorn Ridge and see the work for themselves. He did not look at Caldwell when he said it. He did not need to. He looked at the room, and then he looked at Amelia. And what was in his expression in that moment was something she had not seen there before and did not try to name immediately, because there was a time for naming things, and this was not it. This was the moment just before everything changed. And Amelia Harper had learned in all her years of being patient with hard things that the moment just before was the most important moment to stay steady. She held his gaze. She nodded once, and he nodded back. Outside in the cooling Wyoming evening, as the townspeople filtered around them and Frank walked the horses up from the post, and Caleb helped load the last of what they'd brought, Caldwell appeared beside her. I was close enough that she could hear him without anyone else catching the words. You're going to find, he said quietly, pleasantly, like a man making a friendly observation, that this territory is a great deal harder to navigate when you've made an enemy of the people who know it best. Amelia looked at him. Mr. Caldwell, she said with the same genuine warmth she had given Patricia outside the mercantile, the kind that offered nothing to grip, I've been navigating hard territory since I was 19 years old. She picked up her bag. I think I'll manage. She walked to the wagon. She did not look back. But she heard Nate fall into step beside her, and she heard Frank say something low and satisfied to Caleb that she didn't quite catch, and she felt the solid Wyoming night around her, and the stars overhead, the way she had felt them through the train window. Crossing Kansas, vast and close, and full of something that might, if she let herself believe it, be something like the beginning of what home felt like. She climbed up onto the wagon. Nate climbed up beside her. He picked up the reins, and they rolled out of Red Willow and into the dark road back toward Blackthorn Ridge, and for a long while, neither of them said anything. Then Nate said, You told them about the preferential pricing. Yes. You knew that would land on Caldwell. Yes. And you decided that was the right call. I was going to come after us regardless, she said. The only question was whether he got to do it in a room where nobody knew what was actually in the Cheyenne documentation, or a room where they did. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. I chose the room where they knew. Nate was quiet. You're not angry, she said. She was reading his silence the way she had learned over 8 weeks to read his silences, which were all different and said different things if you paid attention. "No," he said. "But." He looked at her sideways. "But I would have liked to have known that part of the plan before I was sitting in that room." She absorbed this. He was right. It was a fair point. "You're right," she said. "I should have told you beforehand. I made that call tonight without bringing it to you first, and I shouldn't have." The honesty of it seemed to land on him differently than he had expected. He was quiet for another moment. "Thank you for saying so," he said. "It won't happen again," she said. "I believe you," he said. And the thing about Nate Whitmore was that when he said something like that in that particular even quiet tone, he meant it absolutely, and they both knew it. The horses found their pace on the familiar road, and the stars burned enormous above them. And somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote said something to the dark, and the dark said nothing back. Amelia sat beside her husband on the wagon seat and felt the motion of the road beneath them and turned over everything that had happened in that room and thought about what came next. The court in Cheyenne, the Caldwell question, the water rights that were now explicitly in play, in a way they hadn't been before tonight. She thought about all of it, and underneath all of it, quiet and persistent as a heartbeat, she thought about the way Nate had looked at her when he said, "My wife has done more to protect this ranch in 8 weeks." Not as a piece of useful property he had acquired. Not as a problem he was still working out. As something he was willing to stand in front of a room and claim. She did not say any of this. She would think about it later in the quiet of her room with the lamp burning and the ledger closed for the night. But she sat beside him on the wagon and let the night move around them and allowed herself in the careful, private way. She allowed herself most things to feel the full weight of what had shifted tonight. It was not resolution. It was something more fragile and more important than that. It was the first moment she believed without reservation that they were on the same side. The ride home from Red Willow that night felt different from every ride before it, not because anything had been resolved. The Cheyenne hearing was still 6 weeks away. Caldwell's threat still hung in the air like smoke after a fire that hasn't quite finished burning. The water rights were still contested in the way a thing is contested when the person contesting it is patient enough to wait for the right moment rather than force the issue prematurely. None of that had changed. What had changed was the 2 feet of wagon seat between Nate and Amelia. It was the same distance as before. But it felt different. The way a room feels different after a conversation that has shifted something permanent, not louder, not brighter, just changed at some fundamental level that you can't point to specifically, but that you feel in your chest when you breathe. Nate spoke first about a mile from the ranch. "Caldwell came to you before we left," he said. "Outside." It was not a question. "He did," she said. "What did he say?" She told him word for word, because she had decided after the town meeting that there would be no more strategic omissions between them. She had been right at the meeting about the Caldwell information, and she had been wrong to withhold it from Nate beforehand, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and she was comfortable holding both. Nate listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's not done," Nate said. "No," she agreed. "He's not done. What does he do next, if you had to guess?" Amelia had been turning this over since the moment Caldwell walked away from her outside the town hall. "He goes after the ranch directly," she said. "Not through Berg's that play is finished. He'll look for another angle, something closer to home." She paused. "The water rights are the most obvious pressure point, but I think he'll try something social first, something designed to isolate you before he moves legally." "Isolate me how?" "The same way he tried tonight, but more targeted. He'll work the individual relationships, Henderson, the other ranchers, anyone who does business with us. He'll frame the Cheyenne action as aggression rather than defense. He'll make it socially costly to be associated with Blackthorn Ridge." Nate drove in silence for a moment. "He tried that tonight," he said. "Yes, and it didn't work as well as he planned because Henderson was there, and Henderson stood up." She kept her eyes on the road. "So he recalibrates. Men like Caldwell always recalibrate. They don't stop. They just change the angle." So we recalibrate too, Nate said. We prepare, she said. There's a difference. Recalibrating means reacting. Preparing means already knowing what we'll do before he moves. Nate turned to look at her briefly in the dark. She could feel the look even without seeing his face clearly. Have you always been like this? He asked. There was something in his voice that was not quite admiration and not quite bewilderment, and lived somewhere interestingly between the two. Like what? She said. Like you're running a campaign. She almost smiled. My mother called it thinking 3 steps ahead, she said. She said it was either a gift or a burden depending on the day. Which is it today? Today, she said. It feels like a gift. The ranch came into view, and Nate guided the horses in, and Frank took the team, and Caleb helped with the gear and the ordinary machinery of a working ranch. At the end of a long day moved around them, and Amelia stood in the yard for a moment after everything had been attended to, and looked at the main house with its lit windows and thought, this is mine to protect. Not just his. Mine. The thought surprised her with its force. She went inside. The next morning brought its own complications, as mornings at Blackthorn Ridge tended to do. Rosa arrived earlier than her usual time, which was unusual enough that Amelia knew before Rosa said a word that she had brought something specific with her. Rosa had a particular way of carrying difficult information, not reluctantly, but carefully, the way you carry something fragile across an uneven floor. She found Amelia in the kitchen before breakfast and said without preamble, "There is talk in town." "About the meeting," Amelia said. "About you." Rosa set her cleaning supplies down and looked at Amelia directly, which Rosa did when she considered the matter important enough to require eye contact. "Some people are saying you pushed Mr. Whitmore into the legal action, that you came here and changed things without permission, that Mr. Whitmore is being managed by his wife." Amelia was quiet for a moment. "Patricia Caldwell," she said, "and others. But Mrs. Caldwell is the loudest." Amelia poured a cup of coffee and handed it to Rosa, because Rosa had come before her regular time to bring this information, and that deserved acknowledgement. "What do the other women say?" Amelia asked. Rosa accepted the cup. "May Webb says anyone who thinks that hasn't looked at the ranch accounts." She paused. "There are others who don't say anything yet. They are watching." "People who are watching," Amelia said, "are people who haven't decided. That's not a problem. That's an opportunity." Rosa looked at her over the coffee cup with an expression that was unreadable in most of its layers, but had in its topmost layer something that functioned as approval. "I will tell you one more thing," Rosa said. "Mr. Caldwell has been speaking to the men who work the South Creek boundary, the men who manage the water access. He has been speaking to them about their wages and their situation." Amelia went very still. "He's trying to hire away our water crew," she said. "He is talking to them," Rosa said. "Whether they will go, I cannot say." "How many men?" "3. The ones who manage the South Creek rotation." Amelia set down her own coffee cup. 3 men who managed the South Creek water access were not just 3 employees. They were the 3 employees whose knowledge of Blackthorn Ridge's water infrastructure made them genuinely difficult to replace quickly, and the South Creek was the shared water point with Caldwell's own land, which meant pulling those 3 men meant disrupting the water rotation right at the boundary line, which meant she was already moving toward the door. She found Nate at the corral. She told him in 30 seconds flat. His expression did not change dramatically, but something tightened around his eyes that she recognized as Nate Whitmore's version of a significant reaction. "He's moving faster than we thought," Nate said. "He's moving before the Cheyenne hearing," she said. "He wants the water situation destabilized before the court issues any findings. If our South Creek access is disrupted during the hearing period, it looks like we have operational problems. It weakens our position. Or he's simply trying to hurt us before we can hurt him." "Possibly both," she said. "Nate, you need to talk to those 3 men today, not tomorrow, today." "I know." "And you need to offer them something worth staying for." "I know that too." He was already unhooking his horse from the fence post. "Come with me." She blinked. "To talk to the water crew." "You know what to say to people," he said simply. "Better than I do." It was such a plain, ungarnished statement of fact, delivered without any apparent awareness of what it cost a man like Nate Whitmore to say it, that Amelia stood for exactly 1 second, absorbing the weight of it, before she went to saddle her own horse. They found the 3 men, a senior hand named Walt Greer, and 2 younger men brothers named Pete and Daniel Sosa, working the South Creek line in the mid-morning. Walt Greer was 47 and had been on Blackthorn Ridge for 8 years and had the specific wariness of a man who has been approached by his employer in the middle of a workday and suspects the conversation is going to be significant. Nate dismounted and looked at Walt directly. "Caldwell's been talking to you," he said. "Not an accusation, a statement." Walt held his gaze. "He has." "What did he offer?" A pause. Walt was a man of principle, and he weighed his words accordingly. 15% more than I'm making here, separate cabin instead of the bunkhouse, and a contract of 2 years guaranteed. The number landed in the air between them. Amelia watched Nate absorb it. She watched him calculate not just the money, but what it meant that Caldwell was willing to spend that kind of money on a targeted hire. It meant Caldwell was serious. It meant this was not a casual move. "What did you tell him?" Nate asked. "Told him I'd think on it," Walt said. "Which is the truth?" Nate nodded slowly. "Fair." He looked at Pete and Daniel, who were watching with the careful attention of younger men, gauging which way the current was running. "Same offer to you two." Pete spoke. He was 24 and direct in the way young men from working families tend to be direct without surplus words. "Similar." He made it sound like Blackthorn Ridge was going to be in legal trouble, and a man ought to think about where he wanted to be when the dust settled. "And where do you want to be?" Nate asked. The question was simple and genuine, and Amelia recognized it as one of the moments where Nate's particular manner, plain unperformed without manipulation, was more effective than anything more calculated could have been. Pete and Daniel looked at each other. Walt looked at Nate for a long moment. Then Walt said, "I've been at this ranch for 8 years. I know where the water runs and where it doesn't, and I know this land the way I know my own hands. Caldwell's ranch doesn't need a man who knows this particular water. He needs a man who knows this water specifically because knowing it is how you disrupt it." He paused. "I don't like being used as a weapon against a place I've worked." It was the longest speech Amelia had ever heard Walt Greer deliver. Nate looked at him. "Then stay," he said, "and I'll match Caldwell's number." Walt's eyebrows went up slightly. "The cabin I can't do immediately," Nate said. "But by spring I can. You have my word on that." Walt thought about it for exactly as long as he needed to think about it, which was not very long. "All right," he said. He looked at Pete and Daniel. Pete shrugged with the particular controlled nonchalance of a young man who has already decided and is pretending he hadn't. "We stay." Daniel nodded. On the ride back, Nate was quiet for most of it. Then he said, "That's going to cost me." "Less than losing the creek rotation would have cost you," Amelia said. "Yes." He rode in silence for another moment. "He's going to try something else." "Yes." "And we're going to have to be ready for it." "Yes." He looked at her. "You're not worried." "I'm always a little worried," she said honestly. "I just find that worry without preparation is useless, so I generally skip straight to preparation." He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him. It was brief and low, but it was real, and it landed somewhere in her chest with a warmth she hadn't entirely planned for. The preparations for Cheyenne occupied most of the following 2 weeks. Amelia organized the documentation into a presentation that she rehearsed until she could deliver it from memory and still answer questions from the ledger with specific page and line references. Frank helped her understand the procedural aspects of a territorial court appearance. He had been through one years ago in a cattle dispute, and while the particulars were different, the form was similar enough to be useful. Nate watched her prepare. Not intrusively, he didn't hover, which she appreciated. But he was present in the way he had increasingly become present over the weeks, appearing at the edges of things she was doing with the naturalness of someone who has begun to consider a shared space actually shared. He brought her coffee one evening while she was working at the office desk. He set it down without comment. She looked up at him. "Sit down," she said. He did in the chair across the desk, which was technically his chair in his office, but which she had occupied with such consistent purposefulness for the past 2 months that the question of whose chair it was had become genuinely ambiguous. "Tell me what you're worried about," she said. "Actually worried about. Not the practical things, those I have handled. The thing underneath." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that meant he was deciding whether to say the real thing. He said it. "I'm worried that Caldwell has something we haven't found yet," he said. "Something that doesn't have to do with Berg or the water rights or any of the things we've been preparing for." He paused. "Men like Caldwell don't go to a town meeting and lose without having a second position already prepared. We saw one play. I want to know what the second one is." Amelia looked at him. He was right. She had been so focused on the Cheyenne preparation and the water crew situation and the social narrative that she had been treating Caldwell's plays as sequential rather than parallel. A man with Caldwell's resources and patience wouldn't be running one angle at a time. "The land," she said. Nate was still. "Not the water rights," she said, thinking aloud, feeling the shape of it come together the way a ledger comes together when you find the line that makes the columns balance. "The land itself. You said he bought up land fast when he came to this county. Do you know the provenance of all your boundary lines?" Nate's expression shifted. "The North Ridge," he said quietly. "What about it? When I registered the deed on the North Ridge parcel, the county surveyor at the time was a man named Aldous Prentice." Nate said the name like it meant something. "Prentice died 2 years later. His records were taken into county custody." He paused. "The county commissioner at the time was Caldwell's brother-in-law." The office was very quiet. "You think the survey records were altered?" Amelia said. "I think it's possible." He looked at the desk. "I never had reason to question it. The ranch has been running fine. The boundary has never been challenged." "Until now," she said. "Until you became someone Caldwell needed to remove." He looked up at her. "I need to see your original deed," she said. "And we need to find out if there are any copies of the original survey that weren't under county custody. The deed is in the safe. Get it." He got it. They spent 3 hours that night going through the original deed documentation, the boundary descriptions, the survey references. Amelia read land deed language with the same methodical attention she brought to invoice ledgers and found at the bottom of the secondary survey reference page, something that made her set the paper down and press both hands flat against the desk. "Nate," she said. He leaned in. She pointed to a line. A reference to a secondary survey filed with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Not the county, the territory. "If there's a territorial copy," she said carefully, "it would predate any alteration that could have happened at the county level, and it would be in Cheyenne." Nate looked at the reference. Then he looked at her. "We're going to Cheyenne together," he said. She had not expected that. She had suggested Frank accompany her. Frank was practical and reliable, and Nate was needed on the ranch. That had been the plan. "You don't need to," she started. "My ranch, my deed, my wife presenting the documentation," Nate said with a quiet firmness that left no real room for argument. "I'm going." She looked at him. "All right," she said. Frank stayed to run the ranch. They left for Cheyenne on a Monday on the early stage out of Red Willow, and the town watched the Whitmore wagon leave the way. The town watched everything with the specific attention of people storing information for later use. Patricia Caldwell was not visible on the street that morning, which Amelia noted as meaningful in the way that absences are sometimes more meaningful than presences. The stage to Cheyenne took most of the day. They sat across from each other in the coach, and for the first hours there was the natural business-like conversation of two people with a significant task ahead of them, reviewing the documentation, discussing the order of presentation, going over the questions the court clerk had indicated might be raised. Then the practical conversation exhausted itself, and there was quiet. Not the careful, managed quiet of the early weeks. A different kind of quiet. "Can I ask you something?" Nate said. "Yes." "When you were on the train from Ohio," he said, What were you actually thinking about? She looked at him. This was not a question she had expected. Why? Because I've been trying to understand what kind of person boards a train to marry a stranger in Wyoming, he said. And I keep coming back to the fact that I can't picture it. I can't picture what that takes. She looked at her hands for a moment. I was thinking about my mother, she said finally. She died in January, 7 months before I got on that train. He was quiet. She was sick for 2 years, Amelia said. I nursed her through it, and I managed the house, and by the time she was gone there was nothing left. Not money, not property. My brothers were settled, I'd made sure of that before she went downhill. But I had nothing. She paused. I wasn't afraid of Wyoming. I was afraid of staying where I was. And now, he said. Now I'm not afraid of either one, she said. He looked at her with the expression that she had spent 3 months learning to read. The one that was not quite open, but was no longer fully closed. The one that lived in the territory between a wall and a window. I was not kind to you, he said. On the platform. You weren't. I've thought about it a great many times since. I know you have, she said. I've watched you think about it. He blinked. Have you? You get a specific look, she said. Like a man who has said something he'd like to go back and say differently, but knows he can't. She let that sit for a moment. You were afraid, she said. That's what I decided eventually. Not that you were cruel, that you were afraid of what it meant if I turned out to be the right woman. The silence was very full. You were right, he said quietly. I know. That doesn't bother you. That my first instinct was to push you away. My first instinct when I walked off that train was to put every wall I had back up and refuse to need anything from anyone, she said. We both arrived at that platform afraid, Nate. We just showed it differently. He looked at her. Outside the stage window. Wyoming moved past in all its vast, uncompromising beauty. The land that asked nothing of you and forgave nothing, either that simply was in all its difficult and irreducible honesty. I have not been easy to live with, he said. No, she agreed. But you have been worth living with. That's different. Something happened in his expression then. Not dramatic. Not the kind of thing you could describe cleanly to someone who hadn't been watching him for 3 months. But she saw it, and she understood it, and she held it carefully, the way you hold something you have been waiting for long enough, that when it finally arrives, you are almost afraid to close your hand around it in case it disappears. Amelia, he said. Don't say it yet, she said quietly. He stopped. Not here, she said. Not on the stage, when we're home. When this is finished, and we're home. She looked at him steadily. Say it then. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. The way Nate Whitmore nodded when he meant something completely. They arrived in Cheyenne in the late afternoon. The territorial court was a stone building of considerable authority, the kind of building that communicated through its materials alone, that it was intended to last and to be taken seriously. Amelia looked at it from the street and felt the particular combination of clarity and nerve that she associated with moments that mattered. The court clerk met them the following morning. How was a small, precise man named Whitfield, who had the demeanor of someone who had been processing legal documentation for so many years that he had achieved a kind of perfect equilibrium with it. Nothing surprised him. Nothing distressed him. Everything was simply information to be organized and acted upon. Amelia presented the documentation. Whitfield went through it with the methodical attention of his profession, asking questions that were pointed and specific, and that she answered completely and without hesitation, because she had prepared for exactly this, and because the answers were in the ledger, and she knew the ledger, the way she knew the Blackthorn Ridge pantry, without having to think about it. When she finished, Whitfield set the ledger down and looked at Nate. Your wife's documentation is among the most organized I have received in a commercial fraud proceeding, he said. Combined with the materials from Henderson and the 2 prior complainants, the court has sufficient grounds to proceed. Then Amelia said, I also need to inquire about a territorial survey record. She gave him the reference number from the deed. Whitfield disappeared into the back of the records office. He was gone for 20 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying a folder, and his expression had changed in the specific way that the expression of a careful professional man changes when he has found something he recognizes as significant. "The original territorial survey of Blackthorn Ridge filed 1879, he said. He set the folder on the table. "We have a complete copy." He opened it. He pointed to the boundary description on the North Ridge parcel. Amelia looked at it. Then she looked at Nate. Then she looked back at Whitfield. "This boundary line," she said, pointing to the specific notation, "is different from what appears in the county deed records." "It is," Whitfield said. "How different?" Nate's voice was very controlled. "The county record places your North Ridge boundary approximately 40 yards south of where the territorial survey places it," Whitfield said. 40 yards along a half-mile boundary line. Amelia did the quick calculation. "That's approximately half an acre," she said. "Yes," Whitfield said. "But more significant than the acreage is what's on that 40 yards. He looked at Nate. "Your territorial survey shows the spring that feeds your north pasture water supply as falling within your boundary. Your county deed record places it outside." The room was very still. "If Caldwell challenged the county deed," Amelia said carefully, "and the county deed reflects the altered survey, he could claim the spring," Nate said. "He could claim the spring," she confirmed. They looked at each other. This was not the water rights dispute they had been preparing for. This was the land itself. The water that fed the north pasture. The kind of thing that if Caldwell moved on it and the county backed the altered deed could force a negotiation that Blackthorn Ridge was not positioned to win. This was the second play. This was what Caldwell had been waiting to use. "What do we do?" Nate said, and he was asking her directly and without qualification in the way he had begun asking her things, not deferring, not abdicating, but genuinely consulting, because they were on the same side and they both knew it. Amelia looked at Whitfield. "Can the territorial survey supersede the county deed record?" she asked. "In cases of demonstrable alteration, yes," Whitfield said. "The territorial record is the primary legal instrument. The county record is derivative. If we can demonstrate that the county record was altered after the territorial filing, we can demonstrate it," Amelia said. "The alteration would have occurred during a specific period when county land records were under the administration of a specific commissioner." She looked at Nate. "The same commissioner who protected Burge's fraud operation." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I think you and your husband may need to speak with the court's land adjudicator while you're here." "I think we may need to do that too," she said. They were in Cheyenne for 3 days instead of 1. The land adjudicator was a woman named Harriet Drummond, which surprised Amelia, and then did not surprise her because the territorial court system operated under different conventions than the county, and Harriet Drummond had the manner of a person who had been doing precisely this work for years, and had long ago stopped being interested in whether anyone found it surprising. Harriet Drummond went through the territorial survey and the county deed with the focused intensity of a surgeon. On the second day, she looked up from the documents and said, "The county record was altered. The handwriting in the boundary description section of the county deed is different from the handwriting in the rest of the document. It's subtle, but it's there." She set down her pen. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "your North Ridge boundary, including the spring, is where the territorial survey says it is, not where the county deed says it is." She looked at him directly. "And the fact that this alteration occurred during the period in question, administered by a county official with a documented relationship with a man now facing commercial fraud charges in this court." She let that sentence end where it ended. "The court will want to examine this." Nate sat with this for a moment. Then he said with a quiet that was the kind of quiet that comes after something very large has been confirmed, "How long have I not known this?" "Since 1879, Drummond said. "You've owned the spring for 6 years and not known it." "And Caldwell's known the whole time," Amelia said. "Almost certainly," Drummond said. "He would have needed to see both records to understand the discrepancy." "Which means he came to this county knowing what was in those records," Amelia said. "He's been waiting 6 years for the moment to use it." The room was quiet. Nate looked at Amelia. She looked back at him. 6 years. Caldwell had been holding this card for 6 years, waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the moment when Nate was sufficiently isolated, sufficiently pressured, sufficiently off balance to be maneuvered into a negotiation he couldn't win. He had miscalculated exactly one thing. He had not known about Amelia. She felt Nate looking at her, and she held his gaze, and did not look away, because there was nothing to look away from. This was the truth of the thing, all of it. The invoices and the water crew and the town meeting and the stage to Cheyenne and the folder in Whitfield's records office. This was what it all added up to. Someone who was paying attention. Someone who had been paying attention since the first week, because paying attention was what she knew how to do and what she had always done, because it was the only form of survival available to a woman with no money and no family and nothing but her own competence to stand on. She had walked off a train in Red Willow with a suitcase and been told she was the wrong woman. And she had spent 3 months being exactly right. On the third evening before the stage back to Red Willow, Nate found her in the small hotel dining room where they had been taking their meals, sitting with her coffee and her closed ledger, and the specific stillness of a person who has been running hard for a long time and has finally allowed themselves a moment of stopping. He sat across from her. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "We're home tomorrow." She looked at him. "You told me to wait until we were home," he said. She had told him that on the stage 4 days ago. She had not been certain he would remember. She had underestimated him, which she was finding she did occasionally, and which she intended to stop doing. "I did," she said. "So I'll wait until tomorrow," he said. "But I want you to know that I know what I'm going to say." She held his gaze. "I know what you're going to say too," she said. He almost smiled. It was almost a full smile, closer than she'd seen before. "Then we're in agreement," he said. "We usually are," she said. "Eventually." He reached across the table. He set his hand over hers on the closed ledger and left it there, not dramatically, not with any kind of performance, simply with the directness of a man who has decided something and is done with all the hedging around it. She turned her hand over under his. They sat like that in the small hotel dining room in Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, in the autumn of 1885, with the territorial court documentation in Amelia's bag, and the corrected boundary survey, filed with Harriet Drummond, and the case against Harlan Burge, moving toward a conclusion that Caldwell could not stop, regardless of how many years he had been waiting for his moment. They sat there for a while. Neither of them said the word. They didn't need to. Some things are said more clearly through the way a hand stays than through any amount of language. And Nate Whitmore's hand stayed, and Amelia Harper's hand stayed under it, and the evening moved around them, and neither of them moved, and that was the most honest and complete conversation they had ever had. Outside Wyoming held itself in the particular quiet of the territory at dusk, vast and serious and without sentimentality. The kind of country that does not comfort you, but that rewards you slowly and without fanfare for the willingness to stand in it and do the work. Tomorrow they would go home. And the word that had been living unspoken in the space between them since somewhere around the 3rd week, the word that neither of them had been ready to say out loud, yet that word was coming. It was almost there. The stage rolled into Red Willow on a Thursday afternoon, and Blackthorn Ridge was another hour beyond that, and Nate did not say the word on the stage, and he did not say it on the wagon ride home either, and Amelia did not push him, because she understood by now that Nate Whitmore said things when he was ready to say them, and not a moment before, and pushing him toward a moment he wasn't ready for was the surest way to ruin it. But she felt it. She felt it in the way he drove the wagon, not faster than usual, not slower, but with a quality of attention that was slightly different from his ordinary attention, the way a man drives when he is thinking about something specific, and the driving is happening on its own, below the level of conscious thought. Frank met them in the yard. He took one look at their faces and said, "Good trip." It was not a question. "Good trip," Nate confirmed. Frank looked at Amelia. She gave him the short version. The Berg documentation accepted the land survey discovered Harriet Drummond's findings the filing. Frank listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Caldwell's been busy while you were gone." Both of them looked at him. He went to the Webb Mercantile and told Colton Webb that any merchant who continues to supply Blackthorn Ridge exclusively is going to find their county contracts reconsidered at the next commission meeting. Frank said it flatly the way Frank said things he found contemptible without heat, because the contempt was implicit. May told him what he could do with his county contracts. Colton took a little longer, but got to the same place. Anyone else? Nate said. Gruber said no without much discussion. The feed supplier out of the North Road said he needed to think about it. Frank paused. The thinking didn't last long. He came back the same afternoon and said he wasn't going to be told who his customers were by Charles Caldwell. Amelia let out a breath she hadn't entirely known she was holding. He's trying to choke the supply lines, she said. Without Burge as his instrument, he's going directly to the merchants. He's scared, Franca said. Scared men get louder before they get quiet. He's going to get louder still when the court findings come through, Nate said. Let him, Frank said simply. And then in the way Frank occasionally said things that were more than they appeared to be. The ranch is solid. The men are solid. You've been gone 3 days and nothing fell apart. He looked at Amelia when he said it. That's not how it used to be. She understood what he meant. Not that the ranch had been mismanaged before she came, but that there had been a quality of fragility underneath its efficiency. The fragility of a system held together by one person's will, which is always one bad season or one hard decision away from showing its cracks. What had changed in 3 months was not the ranch's material strength. It was the fact that the load was distributed now. There were 2 people pulling instead of 1. Nate heard it too. She could tell by the way he didn't respond to Frank directly, but instead looked at the main house with an expression that was quieter and more considered than his usual expression. He unhitched the horses. She went inside. Rosa had left supper warming on the stove, a simple thing. Beans and cornbread and cured pork in the kitchen smelled like it always smelled in the evenings now, which was the smell of a kitchen that was being used properly and cared for consistently. And Amelia stood in it for a moment, with her traveling bag still in her hand, and let herself feel the specific relief of a place that has become familiar. She had not had a familiar place in a long time. She set down the bag and went to the stove. She was stirring the beans when Nate came in. He washed at the basin by the door. He dried his hands. He stood for a moment in the middle of the kitchen, the way a man stands when he is about to do something he has been working himself up to, and the working up is finally finished. "Amelia," he said. She set down the spoon and turned around. He looked at her across the kitchen, not a long distance, but the particular distance of 2 people who have been carefully maintaining the appropriate space between them for 3 months and are both very aware of it. "I told you I'd say it when we were home," he said. "You did." "We're home," he said. "We are." He crossed the kitchen. He stopped close enough that she had to look up at him, and she did steadily, because she had never been afraid of looking at Nate Whitmore directly, and she was not going to start now. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, without decoration, without performance, without any of the elaborate scaffolding that people build around difficult words to protect themselves from the vulnerability of meaning them. Just the words, plain and direct and absolute. She held them for exactly 1 second. "I know," she said. He almost frowned. "That's all." "I've known for about 3 weeks," she said. "I was waiting for you to catch up." Something crossed his face that was fully, completely, unmistakably a smile, not the almost smile she had been cataloging for 3 months, but the real thing, the one that changed his entire face and made him look briefly like the man he must have been before 6 years of grief had carved him down to his essential shape. "And you," he said, 3 weeks ago. "Longer than that," she said honestly. He looked at her. "Then we've both been waiting," he said. "Yes," she said. "We have." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a carefulness that undid her more than anything dramatic could have. And then he kissed her, and it was the first time, and it was unhurried and certain, and tasted like the end of a very long, very difficult journey that had been worth every mile. The beans nearly burned. She caught them in time. Nate stood at the kitchen table and laughed. Actually laughed, the full sound of it filling the kitchen in a way that made it larger, while she rescued the pot and the sound of that laugh was the best thing she had heard since she stepped off the train in Red Willow, and the best thing she expected to hear for a very long time. The formal findings from the territorial court came 6 weeks later in a document that was thorough and unambiguous, and that Amelia read 3 times, not because she didn't understand it, but because she wanted to make sure she was reading what she thought she was reading. Harlan Berg was found liable for commercial fraud across 4 counts involving 3 ranches. The total amount ordered in restitution was significant enough that Berg's operation in Red Willow would not recover from it. The county commissioner Caldwell's brother-in-law, a man named Estes, was referred for a separate investigation into the administration of county records during his tenure, and in a separate finding attached to the primary document, Harriet Drummond's land adjudication was formalized. The North Ridge boundary of Blackthorn Ridge Ranch was officially recorded at the territorial level as the boundary described in the original 1879 survey. The spring was Nate's. It had always been Nate's. The county record was noted as containing a demonstrable alteration inconsistent with the original filing. Amelia set the document down on the desk. She sat with it for a moment. $214. That was where this had started. An invoice discrepancy she had caught in her first week, because she was the kind of person who checked invoices because her father had not been that kind of person, and she had watched what that cost him, and she had promised herself at 19 that she would not make the same mistake. From that one discrepancy thread by thread, she had pulled until the whole picture came visible. Burge. The county protection. Caldwell's arrangement. The altered survey. The spring that had been stolen so quietly and so patiently that the man who owned it had spent 6 years not knowing it was gone. She picked up the document again. She went to find Nate. How was in the north pasture, which was where he usually was on Wednesday mornings, riding the fence line with Walt Greer in the ritual inspection that Walt had maintained through every season and every difficulty with the reliability of a man who considers consistency to be a form of integrity. Amelia rode out on the horse she had claimed as her own, in the second month a steady gray mare that Frank had selected for her, with his customary lack of sentimentality and complete accuracy, and she found Nate at the fence line and handed him the document without preamble. He read it on horseback. Walt Greer looked at the fence and gave them the specific privacy of a man who has worked alongside someone long enough to know when to look in a different direction. Nate read the entire document. Then he read the land adjudication section again. He folded it carefully and held it for a moment. "The spring," he said. "Yours," she said. Officially permanently on the territorial record. He looked at the north pasture, the land he had ridden every week for 6 years, not knowing that the water source feeding it had been quietly removed from his legal ownership by a man who had been planning to use it against him at the moment of maximum advantage. 6 years. He said quietly. "It's back now," she said. He looked at her. "Because of you," he said. "Because of the invoice," she said. "I followed what was there. Amelia." His voice had the particular quality it had developed in the weeks since Cheyenne, the quality of a man who has stopped managing his own feelings and started simply having them, which was, she had found a much better quality. "You came here with 1 suitcase and you gave me back my ranch." She held his gaze. "I came here to work," she said. "That's what I did." "You came here to work," he repeated, and there was something warm and almost amused in it, the way a man says a thing when he knows it is both exactly true and also a profound understatement. "Yes, you did." Walt Greer coughed quietly somewhere down the fence line. Nate and Amelia looked at each other, and then they both looked at Walt, and Walt was examining a fence post with the focused intensity of a man who has absolutely no idea anything else is happening. "Walt," Nate said. "Sir," Walt said, not turning around. "The spring's ours." Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he turned around and looked at both of them with the measured satisfaction of a man who has been waiting for a piece of good news and is receiving it with appropriate but not excessive enthusiasm. "Good," Walt said. "And then, I'll check the North Junction pipe tomorrow. Been meaning to." He turned back to the fence. Amelia put her hand over her mouth and looked at the sky, and beside her quietly, Nate was doing the same thing he had done in the kitchen over the rescued beans, which was laughing. The town of Red Willow processed the court findings. The way small towns process significant events, with an initial period of intense discussion, followed by a more gradual settling into the new reality, which was a reality in which Charles Caldwell was somewhat less formidable than he had appeared, and the Whitmores of Blackthorn Ridge were somewhat more. Patricia Caldwell stopped making comments about Amelia in the Mercantile. This was noted. Mae Webb noted it specifically and reported it to Amelia with the satisfaction of a woman who has been watching a particular situation develop and is pleased with the direction it has resolved. "She was in here Tuesday," Mae said. "Bought her usual provisions. Said nothing about you at all." "Good," Amelia said. "She looked like she wanted to say something," Mae said. "But she didn't." "Also good," Amelia said. Mae leaned on the counter. "Caldwell's going to be under review. The commissioner's office is being examined as part of the records investigation. The county is very quiet about it, but the territorial oversight is not quiet at all." She paused. "He's going to lose the commission access. Without that, his arrangements fall apart." Amelia thought about Charles Caldwell, his patience, his long game, the 6 years he had spent building toward a moment that had not arrived the way he planned. "He's not finished," she said. "Men like that don't finish." "No," Mae agreed. "But they get smaller. Without the county behind him, he's just a large rancher with a lot of land and some very inconvenient documentation in Cheyenne." She looked at Amelia. "You made him smaller." Amelia picked up her provisions. "The documentation made him smaller," she said. "I just found it." What Amelia had not anticipated, and this was one of the genuinely few things in the last 4 months that she had not anticipated, was what happened at the Blackthorn Ridge supper table on the evening after the court findings arrived. She had made a proper supper. She always made a proper supper. But that evening, she had made an occasion of it, not because she had planned to, but because when she'd gone to the smokehouse that afternoon, she had found a good cut of beef that warranted serious attention. And she had given it serious attention, and the result was a supper that was several degrees above her already elevated usual standard. The hands knew something had happened. Word traveled on a ranch the way water travels along whatever path is available, and quickly. By the time everyone sat down, there was a quality of collective anticipation in the room that was not quite expectation and not quite celebration, but lived somewhere between the two. Nate stood up. This was unusual enough that the table went immediately quiet. Nate Whitmore did not make speeches. This had been established over 15 years by Frank, and over 4 months by Amelia, and was understood as a basic fact of life at Blackthorn Ridge. He stood up. He held his coffee cup. He looked at the table, at Frank, at Walt Greer, at Caleb Moore, who was 20 years old and had grown up slightly in the past 4 months, in ways that had more to do with watching how things were done than with being told, at Harris and Pete and Daniel Sosa, and the 8 other men who made up the working population of the ranch. And then he looked at Amelia, who was sitting to his left in the chair that had become, without any formal decision, her chair. "The territorial court findings came today," he said. "Berg is finished. The spring on the North Ridge is confirmed as ours. The county records are under review." He paused. "None of that would have happened without the person sitting next to me." He looked at Amelia. She looked back at him and held perfectly still, because she was managing something that she did not intend to let the room see. "She came here 4 months ago," Nate said. "She came here as a stranger, and I was not—" He stopped for a brief moment. "I was not what she deserved when she arrived. And she stayed anyway. And she worked. And she did what she said she was going to do, which was take care of this ranch." He lifted his coffee cup. "To Amelia." 20 voices said her name. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table for exactly 3 seconds, and then looked up, because she was not going to cry at her own supper table, if she could help it, and she could help it barely. Frank caught her eye across the table. He said nothing. He just looked at her with the steady, quiet warmth of a man who has watched something difficult become something good and is sitting with the rightness of it. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage. He nodded back. After supper, after the table was cleared and the kitchen was clean and the hands had filtered back to the bunkhouse with the satisfied heaviness of men who have been properly fed. Amelia went out to Clara's garden. She went most evenings now. The garden had come back. Not completely, it would take another season to be fully what it had been, but it was alive again, and the herbs she had found surviving when she arrived had spread back into the spaces that had been empty, and the beds she had turned and planted in her first month had things growing in them that were beginning to look like they intended to stay. She was crouching over the rosemary border when she heard Nate come out behind her. He sat on the porch step. She kept working for a moment. "Do you ever think about Ohio?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. Not the way I used to." "How did you used to think about it?" "Like it was the place I was trying to get away from." She pressed the soil around the base of a small herb she had transplanted from the wild edge of the property. "Now I think about it more like the place that made me who I am, the hard parts included." He was quiet. "Do you think about Clara?" she asked. She asked it without apprehension because they had reached the place where the real questions could be asked, and asking the real questions was the thing she valued most about where they had arrived. "Yes," he said. "Not every day the way I used to, but yes." "That's right," she said. "She should be thought about." He looked at her. "You're not troubled by it?" She sat back on her heels and looked at him. "She planted this garden, Nate. She was here before me. That's not a threat. That's just the truth of this place." She paused. "I'm not trying to be Clara. I never was. I'm trying to be what this place needs now, which is something different." He looked at the garden. "She would have liked you," he said. It landed simply and completely, and she received it the same way. "I would have liked her," she said. "From everything the garden tells me about her, she was a woman who paid attention to things." Nate looked at her with that expression that was no longer ambiguous to her, the full open expression of a man who has finally stopped managing the distance between himself and what he feels. "Come here," he said. She stood up and went to him and sat beside him on the porch step, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat together in the dark Wyoming evening, with the garden in front of them, and the house behind them, and the sound of the ranch settling into its nighttime sounds all around them. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," she said, "about the invoice." He made a sound against her hair. "Of course you are. $214, she said. "That's where all of this started." "And where does it end?" She thought about that. Thought about Burge and Caldwell, and the county commission, and the altered survey, and the spring that had been returned to its rightful owner, and the table full of men who had stood up at a town meeting and said she belonged here. "It doesn't end," she said. "That's the point. There's always another invoice, always another discrepancy that someone's hoping nobody checks." She paused. "There's always someone like Caldwell waiting for the moment when a man gets isolated enough that he'll negotiate from weakness. And the answer to that is never to get isolated." "And how do you prevent getting isolated?" he said, though she suspected he knew the answer. "You build something," she said. "You build something solid enough that it can hold." The men who stayed the neighbors, who stood up the merchants, who said no to Caldwell's threats, that didn't happen because of the documentation. It happened because of what this place has become in 4 months. She looked out at the garden. A place people want to defend. He held her a little closer. "You built that," he said. "We built it," she said. "You had the foundation. I built on what was already here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what I thought on that platform in Red Willow? The actual thought, not the thing I said." She looked up at him. "I thought," he said slowly, "that you were going to see this ranch and see me and decide it wasn't what you'd bargained for and leave on the next train." He paused. "I thought I was doing you a kindness by saying it first, before you could." She absorbed this. "You were protecting yourself," she said. "I was being a coward," he said, "and calling it practical." "You were being afraid," she said. "There's a difference." "You keep making that distinction," he said. "It matters," she said. "Cowardice is a choice. Fear is just what happens when something is real enough to lose." She looked at him. "You were afraid because you knew before you'd spoken a single word to me that this was real. That's not a weakness. That's just being a person." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm not afraid anymore." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I've been watching it leave for about 6 weeks." He laughed, quietly with his chin against her hair. "You watch everything," he said. "Everything," she agreed. "It's very useful." They stayed on the porch step until the stars were fully out, and the cold came down from the ridge the way it came every evening in Wyoming, sharp and clean and without apology. And Amelia leaned into the warmth beside her and thought about all of it one more time. The train from Ohio, the platform in Red Willow, the pantry and the invoices and the town meeting and the territorial court and the garden and the spring that was theirs, and the table full of men who had said her name as a toast. She thought about her mother, who had died in January in a cold Ohio farmhouse, and who had told her once in one of the last clear conversations they'd had that the life you build matters more than the life you're given, and that the only real question is whether you're willing to do the building. Amelia had been willing. She had walked off a train with one suitcase into a place that did not want her, and she had done the building anyway. One invoice, one supper, one ledger entry, one difficult conversation at a time, until she had built something that was hers in the fullest possible sense, not because she owned it on paper, but because she had poured herself into it, and it had changed because of her, and the change was permanent. The wrong woman. That was what he had called her on the platform. She turned the words over one final time, the way you turn over a stone that once hurt you to feel the weight of it from a position of safety, and she found that the words had no weight left. They had been wrong when he said them, and the 4 months since had been an extended and irrefutable proof of exactly how wrong. And Nate knew it, and she knew it, and the 20 men who ate at her supper table knew it, and the Territorial Court of Wyoming knew it, and Mae Webb knew it, and Edmund Henderson knew it, and the garden Clara Whitmore had planted, and Amelia Harper had brought back to life knew it, in whatever way gardens know things, which is quietly and certainly, and without any need to say so. Nate turned and pressed a kiss against her hair. "Come inside," he said. "It's getting cold." She stood up. She took his hand. They went inside together into the warmth of the house that was theirs fully, finally in every way that mattered, and the door closed behind them, and Blackthorn Ridge Ranch held them in the dark. Wyoming night, the way it would hold them through every season that followed, through every difficulty and every harvest, and every hard winter and every spring that came after. Because Amelia Harper had not come to Wyoming to be wanted. She had come to work, and what she had built with her own hands and her own attention and her own unbreakable refusal to be less than what she was a home and a life and a love that no one, not Harlan Berg and not Charles Caldwell, and not the entire County Commission of Wyoming Territory, would ever take from her. She had walked in as the woman nobody wanted. She left her mark as the woman who made everything matter, and that was a fact, written not in any court document or county ledger, but in the bones of the ranch itself, in the surviving herbs, and the balanced accounts, and the table where 20 men ate like human beings, and the spring on the north ridge that ran cold and clean and permanent through every season, belonging exactly where it had always belonged, right where it started, right where it was always meant to be.